Story 1. The arrival of an exotic fruit in a cold land. If you were walking along the canals of Amsterdam in the latter half of the 17th century, your eyes might be drawn not to the goods in the shop windows, but to something placed deliberately in the center of a merchant's table, a single pineapple. It would be impossible to miss its green spiky crown arching upward, the golden flesh beneath protected by a lattice of rough scales. In a city of barrels, bricks, and bales, this fruit was a rare and startling visitor from far warmer shores. For the Dutch, the pineapple was not a common food. In fact, for many it was not food at all. The price of such a fruit imported at great expense from Suriname or the Caribbean colonies placed it firmly beyond the reach of ordinary households. Those who could afford to purchase one outright were among the merchant elite, the men and women whose fortunes were tied to the voyages of the Dutch West India Company. Even for them, a pineapple was often considered too precious to eat. The solution, if you were less wealthy but still eager to impress, was simple. You rented one. Pineapple rental was not a jest, it was a genuine practice, recorded in household accounts and merchant diaries of the era. A pineapple could be hired for a day or an evening, displayed prominently at a dinner party, then returned to its owner, intact. Guests would marvel at its presence, perhaps touch its prickly surface, inhale its scent. The point was not consumption, but display a testament to your connections and your awareness of the world beyond the cold, damp lowlands. It may seem absurd to modern sensibilities, but in the 17th century the Netherlands was at the peak of its maritime power. Exotic goods flooded into Amsterdam, silks from China, spices from the Moluccas, sugar from Brazil. Yet of all these treasures, the pineapple held a peculiar place in the public imagination. It was a fruit not easily preserved. Unlike spices or textiles, it could not survive months at sea without careful handling, and thus, every pineapple that arrived on Dutch shores was a minor logistical triumph. Merchants documented these arrivals in meticulous detail. The ships' manifests recorded not just the pineapples themselves, but the number of days since harvest, the conditions in which they were stored, and the anticipated window for display before the fruit began to brown. This information determined the fruit's market value, sometimes more than a laborer's yearly wage. Why the pineapple mattered. To understand the peculiar allure of the pineapple in 17th-century Dutch society, you must imagine a time when knowledge of the wider world was largely visual. Portraits, engravings, and still-life paintings were the medium by which the exotic was made familiar. Dutch still lifes known as pronksteleven, or ostentatious still life, were compositions designed to celebrate abundance. A pineapple in such a painting was a statement, both artistic and economic. A merchant who displayed a pineapple in his home was effectively staging his own still life for his guests. The fruit's foreignness spoke to the reach of the Dutch trade empire. Its fragility whispered of the expense required to obtain it. In a society that valued thrift yet reveled in the spectacle of wealth, the pineapple was a paradox, an edible luxury meant to be preserved as long as possible. Its symbolism extended beyond the dinner table. In England, pineapples would later become a motif in architecture and garden design, signifying hospitality. In the Netherlands, the fruit's meaning was more mercantile. It was proof that you had access to the most perishable of luxuries, and thus that your trade connections were strong. The mechanics of rental. The practice of pineapple rental was facilitated by merchants and fruit brokers who specialized in rare imports. Upon arrival, pineapples were inspected, their skins checked for bruising or signs of overripeness. A rental price was set, varying with the size and condition of the fruit. The renter would agree to terms. The pineapple must be returned within a set period, usually 24 hours, and in the same condition. Some brokers required a deposit equal to the purchase price of the fruit. In the wealthiest circles, the fruit was sometimes displayed under glass to protect it from curious fingers. Accounts from the period reveal that pineapples could be rented multiple times before finally being eaten, usually by the original importer or a particularly generous host. Once its visual appeal faded, the fruit's value diminished rapidly, and only then was it served. In some cases, the flesh was candied to preserve it further, turning a perishable luxury into a semi-permanent confection. Pineapples in the Dutch colonies. While the fruit was rare in the Netherlands, it was common in the tropical colonies that supplied it. In Suriname, pineapples grew in abundance, tended by enslaved laborers whose lives could not have been further removed from the polite soirees of Amsterdam. For them, the pineapple was a crop like any other one of many cultivated for export alongside sugar cane and coffee. The fruit's journey from the plantation to the merchant's table was long and fraught. First, it had to be harvested at just the right stage of ripeness, mature enough to develop its full flavor, but not so ripe that it would spoil before reaching Europe. Packed carefully in straw-lined crates, the pineapples were loaded onto ships. Even with the fastest vessels, the voyage could take weeks, and many fruits perished en route. Those that survived became part of a delicate balancing act. They had to be displayed before they decayed, yet their rarity encouraged keeping them as long as possible. This tension between preservation and inevitability gave the pineapple a kind of theatrical urgency in the Dutch domestic setting. A status symbol in still life and society. Paintings from the Dutch Golden Age occasionally feature pineapples, though they are far less common than grapes, peaches, or pomegranates. When they do appear, they are usually placed in the center of the composition, often in a position of prominence among other costly items like silverware, imported porcelain, and Venetian glass. These artistic depictions were aspirational. Most viewers would never see a pineapple in person. But for those who did, the fruit carried with it all the weight of its journey, the labor of its cultivation, and the expense of its acquisition. As you imagine this world, picture a quiet Amsterdam parlor in winter. Outside, the canals are beginning to freeze. Inside, a group of merchants and their wives gather around a long table. There is bread, cheese, salted herring, and in the middle, incongruous and exotic, a pineapple. It is not to be eaten. It is there to be admired and to remind everyone present that the host has reached far across the seas to bring something extraordinary into this narrow, drafty room. But what happened when a pineapple's beauty began to fade, when its skin softened and its crown drooped? Would the social value evaporate instantly, or could the fruit's life in Dutch society be extended in other ways? By the time a pineapple had made its rounds at dinner tables and merchant receptions, it had already endured a great deal. The transatlantic crossing, the cold of northern warehouses, the handling by brokers and servants, each step marked a gradual decline from its peak. A fresh pineapple in its prime might be rented several times in the first week after arrival. The arrangement resembled the lending of fine porcelain or silver, careful record-keeping, agreed-upon inspection upon return, and an expectation that the item would be handled as if it were one's own. But unlike a silver tea set, the pineapple could not be polished back to perfection once blemished. When the skin began to show dark patches, rental demand dropped. It was not uncommon for merchants to stage a final farewell display, inviting acquaintances for one last evening of admiration before the fruit's appearance deteriorated beyond the standards of polite society. At this point, the pineapple often found its way into the kitchen for a new chapter of its life. The culinary transformation. Preservation, from fruit to confection. In a world without refrigeration, the preservation of tropical fruit required skill, resources, and patience. Dutch kitchens, particularly those of the wealthy, were adept at transforming perishable goods into long-lasting delicacies. The most common method for pineapples was candying. The process began by peeling the fruit and slicing it into rings. These were then soaked in sugar syrup, sometimes repeatedly over the course of several days, until the flesh became translucent. Sugar, itself a colonial product, was plentiful among the merchant class, making candied pineapple both a logical and symbolic pairing of colonial luxuries. Candied pineapple was served in small portions during winter months, when fresh fruit was scarce. It appeared on dessert trays alongside candied orange peels, preserved plums, and almond marzipan. Unlike the bold display of the whole fruit, candied pineapple was a subtle indulgence, its origins less visible, but no less exotic. The economics of decay. For merchants, the pineapple's decline from rentable display piece to candied treat was not a loss, but a calculated progression. The initial rentals recouped a portion or, in some cases, all of the fruit's purchase price. The final culinary use provided additional value, either for personal enjoyment or as a gift that reinforced social ties. Records from Amsterdam, brokers' ledgers in the late 1600s, show notations like penny pel, 4 guilders rented 3 days, total 1 guilder 12 stuvers, candied thereafter. Such notes capture the pragmatic spirit of the era. Even a fruit so bound up in notions of luxury and display was ultimately folded back into the practical rhythms of household economy. Nothing was wasted, not even the fibrous peel, which might be used to flavor infusions or discarded into the garden compost. The pineapple and the calendar of social life. The arrival of a pineapple in Amsterdam was not a random occurrence, it was tied to the rhythms of maritime trade. Ships from the West Indies and South America arrived during certain months, their cargo determined by both the agricultural calendar of the colonies and the prevailing winds that governed Atlantic crossings. This meant that pineapples tended to appear in the city at predictable times of year, often late summer into autumn. The social calendar adapted accordingly. A hostess planning an important dinner in September might inquire months in advance about the expected arrival of a shipment, reserving a pineapple for her table. Such occasions were carefully staged. A pineapple was not placed casually on a sideboard, it was given prominence, sometimes on a raised stand or within an ornate porcelain dish. The lighting was adjusted to highlight its form, and conversations inevitably circled back to the fruit's origin, the ship that carried it, and the men who had seen it loaded at the docks of Paramaribo or Curaçao. The colonial context. Behind this polite fascination lay the stark realities of colonial exploitation. The pineapples displayed in Amsterdam parlors were the product of an agricultural system dependent on enslaved labor. In Suriname, plantation owners, many of them absentee residents living comfortably in the Netherlands, directed operations from afar, their instructions carried across the ocean by the same ships that transported the fruit. Enslaved workers not only cultivated pineapples, but also maintained the fields, prepared the packing materials, and loaded the crates. Accounts from the colonies describe the labor-intensive nature of pineapple cultivation, the sharp-edged leaves that could cut the skin, the heavy lifting required to transport the harvest, and the back-breaking work of clearing land in tropical heat. These realities were largely invisible in Amsterdam drawing rooms, where the pineapple was stripped of its agricultural and human context. It was transformed into an emblem of refinement, its origins reduced to vague talk of the islands or the Indies. Pineapples in art and aspiration. If the presence of a pineapple in one's home was a mark of status, commissioning its likeness in a painting was an even more lasting declaration. Some merchants, unwilling to bear the recurring cost of rentals, opted for the painted alternative. Still life painters obliged, often relying on sketches or previously imported specimens to recreate the fruit's form with precision. In these works, the pineapple became timeless. It would never rot, never lose its crown's crisp green, never develop the dark spots that signaled decline. It could be positioned among the finest objects, silver flagons, Chinese porcelain, Venetian glass, without the risk of overshadowing them, for it shared their qualities of rarity and craftsmanship. Owning such a painting allowed a household to claim the pineapple's symbolism indefinitely, without the logistical challenges of acquiring the fruit itself. Yet even in painted form, the pineapple remained rare. Only the most ambitious compositions featured it, and then only as a centerpiece. The quiet spread of pineapple imagery. By the late 17th century, the pineapple had begun to seep into decorative arts beyond painting. Carved into furniture, etched onto silver, or painted onto Delft tiles, the fruit's image served as a shorthand for exoticism and refinement. Unlike the actual fruit, these representations could be replicated and owned by a broader swath of society. This democratization of the pineapple's image did not diminish the prestige of the real thing. On the contrary, it heightened the anticipation surrounding its arrival each year. If the picture on a tile was pleasing, how much more impressive would the genuine article be when placed before you? An evening's conversation. Consider for a moment a documented gathering in 1688, recounted in the diary of a merchant's wife. Tonight at the home of Heer van der Velde, we saw the fruit from Suriname called pineapple. It was much admired, its scent sweet though faint. Heer spoke of its voyage, the storms it had endured, and the captain who had kept it safe in his own quarters. Some thought it too costly a thing for a table. Others said it showed the greatness of our trade. I confess I wish to taste it, but it is not to be eaten until the morrow. Such moments were as much about conversation as about the object itself. The pineapple became a focal point for storytelling, a catalyst for tales of far-off lands, maritime danger, and mercantile success. As the 17th century moved toward its close, changes in shipping, cultivation, and trade policy would alter the pineapple's place in Dutch society. But before that shift, it remained what it had always been in the Republic, a fragile, fleeting token of the farthest reaches of commerce. Yet one question lingers: how did this fragile fruit, so costly to acquire and so quick to fade, come to be more than just a curiosity? How did it embed itself in the cultural memory of an era, long after the taste had faded from the tongue? By the dawn of the 18th century, the Dutch Republic's relationship with the pineapple was subtly shifting. Advances in maritime navigation and improvements in the handling of delicate cargo meant more pineapples were arriving each year. While they remained expensive, the aura of near-mythic rarity that had defined them in the 1600s began to diminish. The merchant elite, always keen to maintain an edge in the social display of wealth, sought new ways to distinguish themselves. Some began experimenting with the idea of growing pineapples on Dutch soil, not in open fields, of course, but within carefully controlled environments that mimicked the tropical heat of their native habitat. The hothouse experiment. The introduction of the hothouse glass structures heated by stoves or flues was a game changer. While the English would later become famous for their pineapple-growing glasshouses in the Georgian period, the Dutch had their own early experiments. These were modest by later standards, often attached to existing gardens belonging to wealthy merchants or members of the regent class. A hothouse pineapple was an extravagant undertaking. The fuel needed to keep the interior warm through the long, damp Dutch winters was costly, and the knowledge required to maintain the delicate balance of humidity and heat was rare. Gardeners kept meticulous notes on soil composition, watering schedules, and the precise timing of pollination. The first successful Dutch-grown pineapple caused a minor sensation in horticultural circles. Its owner displayed it not only in his dining room, but also at gatherings of botanical enthusiasts, where it was examined like a precious scientific specimen. Such fruits were never rented out. They were too closely tied to the prestige of their grower. The decline of the rental market. As the novelty of locally grown pineapples spread, though still in extremely limited circles, the practice of renting imported fruits began to wane. While colonial pineapples remained a fixture at major banquets, the idea of hearing one for a modest dinner lost some of its appeal. If a host could not display a pineapple of his own cultivation, he might instead choose another luxury, perhaps an elaborate sugar sculpture or an arrangement of rare flowers. However, in the latter decades of the 17th century, the rental market still held strong in smaller towns. Cities without direct access to colonial imports relied on traveling brokers who carried pineapples from Amsterdam or Rotterdam, carefully packed and cushioned, to be displayed for an evening before moving on to the next paying household. These itinerant fruits sometimes spent weeks on the road, their appearance steadily declining until they were finally consumed or discarded. The pineapple in Dutch memory. Even as its economic and social role evolved, the pineapple remained embedded in the Dutch imagination. It symbolized a specific moment in the Golden Age when the Republic's maritime reach was at its height, and the ability to place a tropical fruit on a table in the middle of a cold northern winter was a small but potent expression of power. Merchants who had displayed pineapples in their youth sometimes spoke of them nostalgically in later years, much as one might recall a fashionable garment or a fleeting social fad. The fruit became shorthand for a time when wealth was more visibly tied to the exotic and the faraway. Pineapple as architecture and ornament. By the early 18th century, the pineapple's image had fully transcended the fruit itself. In addition to decorative arts, it began appearing in architectural ornament carved in stone at the tops of gateposts, cast in lead for garden finials, and painted onto wooden shop signs. In this sense, the pineapple became a kind of heraldic device for those engaged in trade. A merchant who dealt in Caribbean goods might incorporate the fruit into his seal or letterhead. Inns catering to sailors sometimes took names like the Golden Pineapple to signal their connection real or imagined to distant ports. While such imagery was not unique to the Netherlands, the Dutch version often retained a slightly more restrained style, in keeping with the Republic's Calvinist-influenced taste. Even in its ornamental form, the pineapple was presented as an object of commerce rather than of pure hospitality. A surviving tradition in the East Indies. Interestingly, while the pineapple as a rental commodity faded in the Netherlands, a similar practice persisted in the Dutch East Indies well into the 18th century. In Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, European residents sometimes displayed particularly fine examples of tropical fruits for guests before serving them. In these colonial contexts, the fruit was less a rarity and more a marker of the host's ability to procure the best produce from local markets or plantations. Here, the connection between status and access to the finest pineapples mirrored that of Amsterdam a century earlier, though without the transoceanic voyage. The afterlife of a 17th-century fact. By the mid-18th century, the pineapple rental market in the Netherlands was largely gone. Improved supply chains, local cultivation, and changing tastes made the practice obsolete. Yet it left behind an enduring cultural imprint, one that persisted in art, architecture, and the collective memory of the Golden Age. In some ways, the pineapple story is a microcosm of the Dutch Republic itself. It began as a daring import, requiring immense logistical effort. It became a symbol of prosperity and maritime reach, central to the identity of a society at the height of its global influence. And in time, it was replaced by other luxuries, its symbolic power diminished but never entirely erased. Even today, a carved pineapple atop a gate or a painted one on a Delft tile can call back the image of a candlelit Amsterdam parlor, where guests huddled around a table not to eat, but to admire a fruit that had traveled halfway across the world. Reflection: why this boring detail matters. At first glance, the history of pineapple rentals might seem a trivial footnote in the broader sweep of the Dutch Golden Age, but it illuminates the complex interplay between commerce, culture, and human desire. The pineapple's brief career as a rented object reveals the lengths to which people will go to acquire symbols of status, and how those symbols shift over time. It also forces us to confront the hidden systems behind luxury systems of labor, trade, and exploitation that remain invisible in polite settings. The very boring logistics of shipping schedules, storage methods, and rental agreements tell us more about daily life in the 17th century than the grand battles or treaties of the same era. In that sense, the pineapple's journey from tropical field to Dutch drawing room is not just a curiosity, it is a thread in the larger fabric of history, one that connects the mundane with the magnificent, the fleeting with the enduring. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the pineapple, that even the most exotic luxuries are subject to the same life cycle as everything else: arrival, peak, decline, and transformation. With the story of pineapple rentals concluded, our path now leads to another quietly compelling corner of history, where the seemingly mundane hides unexpected significance. Story 2: Ink, Order, and the Quiet Power of the Ledger. If you picture the Dutch East India Company Verenigd Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, you might imagine ships under full sail, brimming with exotic cargo from the East Indies. But the VOC's true lifeblood was not its ships, nor even the spices they carried, but the steady, deliberate work of clerks sitting at long tables, quills in hand, committing the company's business to paper. It is no exaggeration to say that the VOC's rise to global dominance depended on these clerks. Their ledgers bound in calfskin, their pages thick with handmade rag paper, were the memory of the company. Without them, the vast, intricate network of trade that spanned from Amsterdam to Batavia would have dissolved into chaos. The ledger as an instrument of control. Each ledger was, in its own way, a map not of seas and continents, but of obligations, assets, and debts. The company's directors in Amsterdam relied on these records to coordinate shipments months in advance, to anticipate shortages, and to track the fortunes of individual voyages. A single ledger could cover hundreds of transactions: bills of lading for pepper from Bantam, silk from Canton, porcelain from Jingdezhen, and nutmeg from the Banda Islands. It was the clerk's job to capture each detail: quantity, quality, price, port of origin, and the names of merchants or intermediaries involved. These details were not mere formality. A misplaced decimal or a smudged ink line could have consequences reaching far beyond the desk. A missing notation about moisture damage to a bale of silk might lead to disputes months later, when the fabric finally reached Europe. The physical space of record keeping. VOC offices in Amsterdam were functional but not grand. The company's headquarters, the Oostindische Huis, was a sturdy brick building with large windows to admit daylight necessary for clerks who might spend 10 hours copying figures. The air smelled faintly of ink, sealing wax, and the dust of vellum bindings. Clerks sat in rows, each with their own writing slope. Their tools were simple: goosefeather quills, inkwells of iron gall ink, blotting sand to prevent smears, and a small knife to keep the quill's nib sharp. Beside them, stacks of paper waited for entries. Behind them, tall shelves held completed ledgers, organized by year and by trade route. The work was monotonous, but there was comfort in the monotony. The regular scratch of quills, the thump of a heavy ledger closing, the quiet exchange of figures between desks, these sounds formed the background music of the VOC's administrative heart. Training and precision. A clerk did not simply walk in off the street. Most began as apprentices, learning under senior bookkeepers who drilled them in the VOC's exacting system. Figures were to be written with a consistent hand, columns kept perfectly aligned, and all entries double-checked. Errors were not tolerated. A mistake that could not be neatly corrected required the page to be recopied in full, a tedious process that impressed upon apprentices the value of precision. This culture of accuracy was part of what allowed the VOC to operate with such efficiency across distances that would otherwise have swallowed information into silence. The flow of information. Information moved through the VOC like water through a series of locks. A ship arriving in Amsterdam brought not just goods, but reams of paperwork, cargo manifests, letters from company factors in Batavia, receipts from transactions in Ceylon or Malacca. These documents flowed to the clerks, who integrated them into the master ledgers. From there, summaries were prepared for the company's directors. Decisions whether to send more ships to a given port, to adjust the purchase price of cinnamon, or to alter credit terms with a trading partner were made on the basis of these summaries. The ledgers themselves rarely left the office, but their contents shaped the movement of ships, the rise and fall of markets, and the fortunes of investors. Paper as a defensive wall. In an era when lawsuits over damaged cargo or disputed payments could drag on for years, the VOC's ledgers were its shield. A well-maintained record could settle a dispute before it reached the courts, demonstrating that a debt had been paid or that a shipment had been received in good order. The legal system of the Dutch Republic placed great weight on written evidence, and VOC clerks understood that they were not merely recording numbers, they were producing documents that might one day be read aloud in a courtroom. For that reason, they wrote with care, clarity, and the expectation that every line might be scrutinized by strangers. The boring brilliance of double-entry bookkeeping. One of the VOC's most powerful tools was the double-entry system, which balanced every credit with a corresponding debit. This method, developed in Renaissance Italy, allowed the company to track not just what it owned, but also what it owed. For the clerks, this meant that every transaction was entered twice, once on each side of the ledger. The balancing of these entries was a ritual. At the end of each week, columns were totaled and cross-checked, discrepancies hunted down until the books aligned perfectly. To the outsider, this process might seem painfully dull. To the clerk, it was the foundation of trust, proof that the numbers could be relied upon, that the company's vast machinery was in harmony. Clerks as invisible power brokers. Though they rarely left their desks, VOC clerks wielded quiet influence. A well-placed note in the margins of a ledger could draw a director's attention to a problem. A carefully phrased summary could sway opinion on a trade policy. Yet clerks were expected to be invisible. Their role was not to decide policy, but to make policy possible by providing accurate, timely information. The best clerks were those whose work was so flawless that it seemed to disappear, numbers flowing effortlessly into place, ready for others to act upon. The human side of the ledger. For all its precision, the ledger was not immune to human drama. Marginal notes occasionally reveal flashes of frustration, complaints about late ships, irritation with sloppy paperwork from overseas offices, or exasperation at goods arriving damaged beyond sale. Sometimes, too, the dry language of commerce could not entirely mask tragedy. A notation about a missing shipment might be followed by the brief statement, "Crew lost at sea." No more detail was given. The ledger moved on to the next entry. The human cost was acknowledged, but the machinery of trade did not stop. By the close of the 17th century, the VOC's ledgers had become as much a symbol of its power as the ships that carried its goods. Yet these books, so central to the company's success, were also fragile. Fire, damp, or neglect could destroy them, and with them, the memory of transactions worth fortunes. How, then, did the VOC safeguard these records, and what systems were in place to ensure their survival across decades of trade? The answer lies in the company's archives, vaults of paper that were as heavily guarded as any warehouse of spices. The VOC understood something that many of its competitors did not. Memory is a form of capital. A warehouse full of pepper or nutmeg could be sold for profit, but a well-maintained archive could prevent losses, resolve disputes, and guide future ventures. By the late 1600s, the company's headquarters in Amsterdam maintained a dedicated archive room, a high-ceilinged chamber with thick walls and small windows to limit sunlight. Inside, rows of shelves and cabinets held the ledgers, journals, and correspondence that formed the intellectual infrastructure of the VOC. The physical security of records. Safeguarding the ledgers began with controlling the space. The archive room was accessible only to senior clerks and company officials. A heavy door, fitted with an iron lock, was kept closed at all times, and a log recorded who entered and when. Within the room, ledgers were stored upright, each identified by a vellum tag at the spine. The most valuable volumes, those containing the master accounts, were kept in locked cabinets inside the archive itself, a precaution against both theft and casual tampering. The greatest threats to the collection were fire and damp. Open flames were forbidden in the archive. Light was provided by narrow windows during the day, and work within was generally limited to daylight hours. To combat moisture, the building's foundation had been raised above the street level, and charcoal braziers were sometimes placed in adjoining corridors to keep the air dry. The chain of custody. The journey of a ledger from a clerk's desk to the archive followed a strict procedure. When a volume was filled, the clerk responsible would review it page by page with a senior bookkeeper. Corrections were made if necessary, and the entire ledger was then signed and dated by both men. Only after this verification could the ledger be carried to the archive. There, the archivist entered it into the master inventory, a ledger of ledgers, as it were, before placing it on the shelf in its assigned location. This process created a chain of custody that ensured no volume could vanish without notice. Duplication as insurance. Given the months-long voyages that connected the Netherlands to its Asian outposts, the VOC developed a system of duplication to protect against loss. Each major set of accounts existed in at least 2 copies, one in Amsterdam, one in Batavia. These copies were not identical in every respect. Differences in currency, local transactions, and shipping schedules meant each version had its own unique entries, but the core data overlapped. If a ship carrying one set of records was lost at sea, the company could reconstruct the missing information from the surviving copy. In some cases, even the most important correspondence was copied multiple times and sent by different ships to ensure at least one arrived. This redundancy was costly in terms of labor. Every duplicate page meant hours of careful writing, but it was far less costly than losing irreplaceable data. The archival mindset. Clerks and archivists alike approached their work with a long view. A ledger completed in 1690 might not be consulted for years, but when it was needed, it had to be in perfect order. The knowledge that these books might one day be read by people far removed from the original transaction gave the clerks' work a peculiar sense of permanence. They wrote for the present, but also for the future, for directors who had not yet taken office, for merchants who had not yet been born. In this way, the archive was both a record and a message across time. Here is what happened. Here is what we decided. Here is what we owned. When the archive was tested, the VOC's archives were not mere bureaucratic decoration. They were active tools in disputes, both within the Republic and in dealings with foreign powers. In 1692, for example, a disagreement arose between the VOC and a Portuguese merchant over a cargo of pepper, allegedly damaged before shipment from Malacca. The merchant claimed the pepper had been damp upon loading. The VOC countered that it had been in good condition when it left the company's warehouses. The matter was settled not by witnesses but by the ledgers. An entry from Malacca noting the dryness of the pepper at the time of shipment, corroborated by warehouse logs from the port. The case never reached court. The Portuguese merchant, faced with the written evidence, withdrew his claim. The quiet role of the archivist. The archivist's position was one of both prestige and responsibility. Unlike the clerks, who dealt daily with fresh transactions, the archivist was the guardian of the company's memory. He needed to know the contents of the shelves well enough to retrieve any volume on request, often within minutes. His job required an encyclopedic recall of dates, voyages, and trade routes, as well as an ability to read the cramped handwriting of clerks long dead. Archivists rarely achieved fame, but within the company their importance was unquestioned. A good archivist could save the VOC from costly mistakes simply by producing the right book at the right moment. Paper and the scale of empire. By the close of the 17th century, the VOC's archive in Amsterdam contained thousands of volumes. Each was a physical object, heavy, tangible, resistant to easy duplication beyond the handwritten copy. The weight of these books was not only literal, they represented the scale of an empire maintained on paper. Every transaction, every voyage, every contract signed in a port half a world away found its way into these pages. Without them, the VOC would have been nothing more than a collection of scattered merchants, each acting on partial knowledge. With them, it was a coordinated, calculating entity capable of directing trade across oceans and decades. The ledger as a symbol. Outside the walls of the Oostindische Huis, the public rarely saw the VOC's ledgers. Yet among investors and rival merchants, the idea of the ledger had symbolic power. It stood for the company's discipline, its ability to account for every guilder, every barrel of cloves. The ledger was, in a sense, a weapon, a way of projecting authority not through force, but through the mastery of information. In an age when rumors could move markets, the company's directors could point to their records as proof of stability. The fragility beneath the order. For all their apparent permanence, the ledgers were vulnerable. Paper could burn, ink could fade, moisture could turn pages to pulp, even political upheaval could threaten them. A sudden seizure of company property by a hostile government might result in the loss of archives as collateral damage. The VOC's clerks and archivists knew this. Perhaps it was part of what gave their work its air of quiet urgency, the understanding that each stroke of the quill was both a creation and a race against time. Yet even with all these precautions, one question remained. What happened to the ledgers once they were no longer in active use? Were they simply stored indefinitely, or did the company find ways to extract new value from old paper? When a ledger had served its primary purpose, its accounts reconciled, its figures incorporated into newer books, it did not simply vanish into obscurity. The VOC treated its paper memory with the same careful deliberation it applied to ships, warehouses, and fortresses. Old ledgers were stored in a separate part of the archive, away from the day-to-day bustle of the active record room. Here, they sat in neat ranks, their spines facing outward, some darkened by age, others still showing the faint gleam of gilt lettering. This was the deep memory of the company, a place where decades-old voyages could be revisited at will. Consulting the past. While these retired ledgers might rest untouched for years, they were far from forgotten. A change in trade routes, a dispute over long-settled debts, or an inquiry from a foreign government could send a clerk or archivist delving into the stacks for an account written generations earlier. For instance, in 1705, a sudden shortage of cinnamon in the Amsterdam market prompted the directors to investigate whether a similar shortfall had occurred in the past. The answer was found in a ledger from 1659, which recorded an identical shortage caused by storms off the coast of Ceylon. The lesson that such disruptions were cyclical allowed the VOC to anticipate recovery rather than panic. Teaching tools for new clerks. Old ledgers also had a quieter educational use. Apprentices were sometimes assigned to copy sections of them, not for archival purposes but as practice. The older handwriting, often more ornate than contemporary styles, forced the apprentice to develop an eye for detail. These exercises taught more than penmanship. By transcribing actual transactions, apprentices absorbed the structure of the company's records, the way each entry flowed from date to goods to quantity to price. They learned to respect the ledger as an integrated whole, where each figure connected to others across pages and volumes. Paper as material resource. In some cases, ledgers reached a point where their practical value was negligible. A volume covering transactions of a minor port that had since fallen out of use, or accounts for goods no longer traded, might be considered expendable. Even then, the VOC was reluctant to destroy them outright. Paper was valuable, and blank or lightly used pages might be repurposed for internal memoranda or draft correspondence. Occasionally, damaged ledgers were dismantled, their pages cut and used as protective wrapping for smaller shipments, an unceremonious end for what had once been the company's official memory. The ledger as evidence beyond commerce. The reach of these books extended beyond trade. The VOC operated in territories where Dutch governance intertwined with company interests, and the ledgers sometimes contained information relevant to diplomacy and law. Records of payments to local rulers, for example, could be used to demonstrate the legitimacy of Dutch claims to certain trading rights. Likewise, entries detailing the provision of goods or ships for military purposes could confirm the company's role in supporting the Republic's broader strategic aims. It was not unheard of for the States General to request access to the VOC's archives during negotiations, treating the ledgers as primary evidence in matters of state. In this way, the company's bookkeepers indirectly influenced political decisions far beyond the counting house. A cultural artifact in the making. By the early 18th century, some VOC officials had begun to recognize that the company's ledgers were more than just operational records. They were a history of the Dutch Republic's reach across the globe. A ledger recording the first voyage to a new port could be seen as the written equivalent of planting a flag. Even the more mundane entries listing sacks of rice, bolts of cloth, or bundles of cinnamon were part of a narrative of expansion, adaptation, and connection. The very dullness of the records was their strength. They reflected the persistent, cumulative work of commerce, not the drama of a single battle or treaty. The emotional distance of the clerk. For the men who filled these books, however, the sense of historical importance was often muted. A clerk's satisfaction came from a day's work completed without error, a column of figures adding up neatly. They might never see the ports or goods they recorded, nor meet the people whose lives were bound up in the transactions. This detachment was part of the system's stability. The clerk was there to write, not to judge, to record, not to intervene. The ledger was impartial because its authors were trained to be so. From golden age to changing tides. As the 18th century progressed, the VOC's fortunes began to waver. Competition from the British East India Company, shifts in global trade patterns, and growing administrative costs strained the once profitable enterprise. In this new climate, the ledgers took on an additional role, revealing inefficiencies. Directors combed through past records to identify underperforming routes or commodities. Patterns that had once signaled opportunity now hinted at overreach. The same books that had guided the company's expansion became tools for managing contraction. Legacy of the ledger. When the VOC was eventually dissolved in 1799, its archives spanning nearly 2 centuries were absorbed into state custody. Many of the ledgers survived the transition, preserved not for their immediate utility, but for their value as historical documents. Today, these volumes are consulted by historians tracing everything from the economics of the spice trade to the personal fortunes of individual merchants. In their pages, the rhythm of global commerce is preserved. Ships departing and arriving, goods bought and sold, prices rising and falling. What is most striking, perhaps, is how little the style changes across the decades. The same careful hand, the same columns and headings, the same steady accumulation of detail, each book part of a long, unbroken conversation between past and present. Reflection, the beauty of the boring. It is tempting to think of history as a series of grand events, but the VOC's ledgers remind us that empires are built and sustained in the quiet work of recording and reconciling. The ink-stained fingers of a clerk in Amsterdam had as much to do with the Republic's global influence as the captain of a flagship rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The boredom of the ledger was, in fact, its genius. By reducing the vast complexity of global trade to neat columns of figures, the VOC could manage the unmanageable. Each page was a small act of order in a world that was, for most people, unpredictable and chaotic. In this way, the VOC's clerks and archivists were not just record keepers, they were the stewards of a system that could only exist because it was written down, balanced, and preserved. With the ink dried on this story of paper and discipline, our attention turns to another unassuming force that shaped the Dutch Golden Age, one measured not in books or fruits, but in the long, slow voyages that tied the Republic to its farthest possessions. Story 3: The Long Road by Sea. If you had set sail from Amsterdam in the 17th century, bound for Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, you were not just embarking on a voyage, but on a slow, methodical process that could consume nearly a year of your life. To the merchants who invested in these journeys, the route was a bridge between the chilly canals of the Dutch Republic and the steamy spice ports of the East Indies. To the sailors and officers aboard, it was a world of routine, hardship, and waiting. The trip was measured not in days or even weeks, but in stages. The cold, gray passage through the English Channel, the unpredictable Atlantic down to the Cape of Good Hope, the long stretch across the Indian Ocean, and finally, the complex navigation into the port of Batavia. The VOC called it the Oostindievaart, the East Indies Voyage, and it was the central artery of the company's existence. The manifest, a paper compass. Before a single sail was hoisted, the ship's cargo manifest was prepared in painstaking detail. This was the master list, the paper embodiment of the ship's purpose. It recorded every barrel of salted herring, every cask of Geneva, every bundle of European woolens, every crate of guns and powder. These goods were not for the crew, they were the trading stock intended for Asian markets, to be exchanged for spices, tea, silk, and porcelain. The manifest was more than an inventory. It was a declaration of value. Copies were kept in Amsterdam, sent ahead to Batavia by earlier ships, and guarded by the ship's supercargo, the company's representative in charge of commerce. A missing item on arrival could spark weeks of correspondence and no small amount of suspicion. Departure and the first weeks. Leaving Amsterdam was itself a process. Ships often waited for favorable tides and winds to carry them through the Zuiderzee and into the North Sea. The first leg past England and into the Atlantic was fraught with risks, storms, hostile ships, and the ever-present threat of disease in the cramped quarters below deck. In the early weeks, the ship was still heavy with European goods. Barrels of flour, salted meat, and ship's biscuit took up much of the space. The biscuit, hard, dry, and capable of lasting months, was a dietary staple, though often infested with weevils by the second month at sea. Life aboard, the boredom between ports. For the sailors, life settled into a pattern. Watch shifts alternated every 4 hours, day and night. Work consisted of maintaining sails, scrubbing decks, repairing ropes, and pumping out the bilge water that seemed to seep endlessly into the hull. The routine was broken only by storms, sightings of other ships, or the occasional encounter with sea life, a pod of dolphins, a passing whale. Meals were predictable: biscuit, salted meat or fish, dried peas, and sometimes cheese. Fresh food was rare after the first weeks, and the crew's health depended on occasional stops to take on fruit and vegetables to ward off scurvy. The Cape of Good Hope, the turning point. After months at sea, the first major destination was the Cape of Good Hope. Here, the VOC maintained a vital refreshment station, established in 1652 precisely to support the East Indies trade. At the Cape, ships could take on fresh water, vegetables, and meat. The surrounding settlement, populated by company servants, soldiers, and farmers, provided a brief taste of land life. Repairs were made, damaged rigging replaced, and sometimes crew members who had fallen ill were left behind to recover, or in some cases to die. The Cape was also a point of communication. Ships bound for Amsterdam from Batavia could pass letters, news, and even small parcels to those heading in the opposite direction. It was here that sailors might learn of political changes in Europe, shifts in trade policy, or the outbreak of new wars. Crossing the Indian Ocean. The leg from the Cape to Batavia was often the most monotonous. Winds could be steady for days, propelling the ship swiftly eastward, or they could fail entirely, leaving the vessel becalmed under a punishing sun. The cargo hold, by now partly emptied of European goods, grew hotter and more oppressive. The constant damp of the lower decks encouraged mold, and the stench of spoiled provisions was a common complaint. Rats, which had boarded at Amsterdam or the Cape, gnawed their way into sacks of grain. Still, the Indian Ocean crossing was not without its dangers. Tropical storms could rise suddenly, forcing the crew to reef sails and batten hatches in a desperate bid to keep the ship intact. Navigators relied on dead reckoning and celestial observations, always aware that a mistake could put them hundreds of miles off course. Arrival in Batavia, the Great Exchange. When a VOC ship finally entered the harbor of Batavia, the journey's monotony gave way to a rush of activity. The port was a controlled chaos of vessels from across Asia. Chinese junks, Malay prahus, Portuguese caravels, and other Dutch ships, all vying for space and attention. Unloading began almost immediately. European goods were transferred to company warehouses, inspected and recorded in Batavia's own ledgers. In their place came the treasures of the East: nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, tea, and porcelain, packed for the long return voyage. For the crew, Batavia meant both relief and new challenges. The climate was oppressive, disease was rampant, and the strict VOC regulations limited their movements. Still, the chance to rest on land, to drink fresh water without the tang of bilge, and to sleep without the constant motion of the ship was a welcome reprieve. The voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia was not a tale of constant adventure, but of endurance, routine, and the management of details that could mean the difference between profit and loss. Yet one might ask, how did the VOC keep such long, slow journeys profitable, given the risks, delays, and decay of goods? For the VOC, the journey to Batavia was as much an exercise in mathematics as it was in seamanship. Profit depended on anticipating losses of goods, of crew, of time, and structuring the voyage to absorb them without eroding the margins. In this way, the months-long crossing became a kind of moving calculation, with every day's events shifting the final balance. Cargo as a layered investment. The goods carried from Amsterdam were not uniform in value or in vulnerability. The manifest was arranged with this in mind. At the bottom of the hold were heavy, durable items: iron, copper, barrels of gunpowder that could withstand the damp and shifting weight of other cargo. Above them came textiles, often packed in oiled cloth to resist moisture. At the top, near the hatch for easier access, sat goods likely to be traded or offloaded before Batavia, such as wine or spirits for sale at intermediate ports. The distribution was not just about convenience, it was also a hedge against loss. If the lower decks flooded, the heaviest goods might be damaged but not destroyed, while the more fragile items were better protected above. Each layer represented a different portion of the voyage's potential profit, and the arrangement was a physical reflection of the VOC's risk management. Manifests as working documents. Once at sea, the manifest was not static. The supercargo updated it regularly, noting items consumed by the crew, goods traded at stopovers, or losses from damage. These updates were often done in pencil or faint ink. At first, final entries would be made upon arrival in Batavia, when the full picture of gains and losses was known. Each notation had financial implications. A barrel of wine spoiled en route was not just a waste, it was a subtraction from expected profits, and sometimes a signal to adjust future provisioning. The manifest thus became a kind of voyage diary, not of people, but of objects. The problem of perishables. Some goods, particularly food and drink, were both cargo and necessity. Ships often carried surplus provisions intended for sale in Batavia, but these had to survive the voyage in edible condition. Cheese, salted fish, and ship's biscuit were generally safe bets, but barrels of beer often soured in tropical heat, and casks of fresh water became stale within weeks. The VOC factored spoilage into its pricing. Beer that lasted 3 months fetched a certain price. Beer that turned to vinegar might still be sold locally for cooking or cleaning, though at a fraction of its intended value. Losses of this kind were anticipated, not catastrophic, but they reinforced the need for constant vigilance over storage and ventilation. Weather currents and the calendar. Voyage profitability also depended on timing. Sailing too late in the season risked encountering storms in the Indian Ocean. Leaving too early could mean long periods of calm in the Atlantic. The VOC plotted departure windows with meticulous attention to historical weather records, which were kept alongside financial ledgers. The Cape of Good Hope was a particular pivot point. Ships arriving there too late in the year might face adverse winds on the next leg, prolonging the journey and increasing the risk of cargo deterioration. For goods like textiles or delicate glassware, an extra month at sea could mean arriving with unsellable stock. Insurance and shared risk. Not all loss was borne directly by the VOC. Some voyages were structured as joint ventures, with private investors taking on a portion of the cargo in exchange for a share of the profits. This arrangement spread the risk and allowed the company to carry a more diverse load than it might otherwise afford. Insurance contracts were another layer of protection. Dutch marine insurance was already well developed in the 17th century, and policies could cover everything from loss by storm to theft in foreign ports. The cost of these policies was built into the pricing of goods, meaning that even a disastrous voyage might recover some of its investment. Crew as an economic factor. The health and stability of the crew were essential to keeping the voyage profitable. A ship that lost too many sailors to disease or injury could not operate at full efficiency, slowing progress and endangering cargo. Wages were a significant expense, and the VOC's contracts often included incentives for surviving the voyage in good-standing small bonuses paid upon safe return to Amsterdam. These were cheaper than replacing experienced crew, and they encouraged discipline during the long months at sea. In extreme cases, crew could also become part of the trade system itself. Skilled carpenters or gunners might be temporarily assigned to VOC outposts in exchange for goods or services, their absence filled by local hires for the return voyage. Intermediate trading. While the voyage's ultimate goal was Batavia, some ships made planned stops to trade along the way. These exchanges could offset losses from spoiled or damaged goods, or simply provide faster turnover profits. At ports along the African coast, for instance, Dutch ships might sell surplus European goods in exchange for ivory or other local products. These were then carried onward to Asia, where they commanded a higher price. Each such transaction was carefully documented, both for accounting purposes and to ensure the cargo arriving in Batavia still met company expectations. The long view, profit in context. A single voyage's profit or loss was rarely decisive for the VOC as a whole. The company thought in terms of fleets and multi-year cycles. A poor season in the East Indies might be offset by strong sales in Japan or the Persian Gulf. A ship lost rounding the Cape could be absorbed into the broader balance sheet. This perspective allowed the VOC to commit to voyages that, on paper, looked precarious. The value of maintaining a regular presence in certain ports outweighed the occasional loss, and the steady rhythm of departures and arrivals kept investors confident. The human cost in economic terms. While VOC accounting did not dwell on the human experience, the death of crew members was an economic variable. Each loss meant a payout of back wages to the family, as well as the cost of recruiting and training replacements. Ships often left Amsterdam overstaffed, anticipating that a certain percentage of sailors would not survive to Batavia. Disease, particularly scurvy, was the most common cause of death. Despite periodic efforts to carry citrus or other antiscorbutic remedies, the long legs between ports still claimed lives. These losses were normalized in the financial planning of voyages, an uncomfortable reminder that even human survival was, in the VOC's view, part of the cargo ledger. With so much riding on such a slow, uncertain process, one might wonder, what did arrival in Batavia actually look like from a merchant's perspective? And how did the long months of preparation and calculation culminate in the frenzied activity of trade in the East Indies? When a VOC ship finally sighted the coast of Java, the long monotony of the voyage gave way to a sudden, compressed burst of purpose. Months of routine scrubbing decks, rationing food, making slow headway under wind and current condensed into a few days of intense activity. For the crew and the merchants aboard, Batavia was not simply a destination. It was the pivot point of the entire East Indies operation, the place where European goods became Asian goods, and where the voyage's profit was ultimately decided. The harbor of a trading empire. Batavia's harbor in the late 17th century was a crowded, noisy tableau. The VOC's fortified walls overlooked an anchorage dotted with ships from across Asia, Chinese junks laden with silk and porcelain, Malay vessels carrying pepper and tin, Arab dhows from the western Indian Ocean, and smaller local craft ferrying goods from nearby islands. Dutch ships arriving from Europe had to wait their turn to be unloaded, a process managed by VOC port officials who controlled the flow of goods into the company's warehouses. Anchoring close to shore was impossible due to the shallow waters, so lighters flat-bottomed barges were used to ferry cargo between ship and land. This added another layer of handling, and with it, another opportunity for damage or loss. The unloading process. Cargo was brought ashore in strict order. First came goods needed immediately for trade negotiations, firearms, textiles, and certain luxury items like European glassware. Next came bulk goods such as metals and ship's provisions, followed by personal consignments belonging to the officers or private traders aboard. Each crate and barrel was checked against the manifest. Discrepancies, whether due to spoilage, theft, or clerical error, were noted in Batavia's ledgers. The supercargo was expected to explain these differences, and in some cases, the matter was referred back to Amsterdam for final resolution. The exchange, from European to Asian goods. Once the European goods were secured in the VOC warehouses, the process of exchange began. Batavia was not merely a final market, it was a hub for redistribution. Spices from the Moluccas, pepper from Sumatra, cinnamon from Ceylon, and textiles from India all passed through its warehouses on their way to Europe. Merchants in Batavia, many of them VOC employees stationed for years at a time, negotiated with local traders, regional rulers, and Chinese middlemen to secure these goods. Payment might be made partly in European merchandise, partly in silver coin brought from Amsterdam or acquired through trade in Japan. Some transactions were straightforward, a set quantity of nutmeg in exchange for a fixed number of muskets. Others were more complex, involving multi-stage exchanges, European woolens for Indian cottons, which were then traded for spices in the Moluccas. The goal was always to maximize the value of the cargo on the return voyage. Quality control and packaging. Before goods were loaded for the return trip, they underwent careful inspection. Spices were sorted to remove damaged or inferior product, porcelain was checked for cracks, and textiles were inspected for mold or insect damage. The VOC's reputation in Europe depended on delivering high-quality goods, and a ship that arrived with substandard cargo could depress prices for months. Packaging was critical. Spices were sealed in barrels lined with palm leaves to keep out moisture. Porcelain was packed in straw inside wooden crates, and tea was compressed into chests wrapped in oiled paper. Each method was the product of long experience, designed to withstand months of movement, shifting temperatures, and the constant damp of the sea. Repairs and resupply for the return voyage. The return trip to Amsterdam was as long and perilous as the outward leg, and ships often spent weeks in Batavia undergoing repairs. Hulls were scraped of barnacles, rigging was replaced, and fresh sails were fitted. Stores of food and water were replenished, with an emphasis on goods that could survive the passage to the Cape and beyond. Crew rotations also occurred here. Some sailors signed off in Batavia, either to remain in Asia or to transfer to another VOC ship. New recruits, often local men or Europeans who had been living in Batavia, were added to replace losses from the outward voyage. Life ashore for the crew. For sailors accustomed to the cramped quarters of the ship, Batavia's streets and markets were both overwhelming and dangerous. The climate was oppressive, the food unfamiliar, and disease, particularly malaria, was a constant threat. The VOC enforced strict discipline on shore leave. Drunkenness, fighting, or fraternizing with locals without permission could result in fines or confinement aboard ship. Despite these restrictions, many sailors spent their wages in the markets, buying small luxuries to bring home or trade privately. Record-keeping and correspondence. While goods were being loaded, the VOC's administrative machinery went into overdrive. The supercargo prepared detailed reports for the directors in Amsterdam, summarizing the voyage, the transactions in Batavia, and recommendations for future shipments. Copies of these reports were made and sent by different ships to minimize the risk of loss. The Batavia office also sent out correspondence to other VOC outposts, Ceylon, Malacca, Banda, updating them on market conditions, requesting specific goods, or adjusting prices based on recent sales. These letters ensured that the company's far-flung network operated as a coherent whole, even when months separated the sending and receiving of information. The human meaning of arrival. For the merchants and supercargo, arrival in Batavia meant the culmination of a long chain of calculations. For the sailors, it was a brief pause between one exhausting journey and the next. Some would never make the return trip, succumbing to disease or choosing to remain in the Indies. Others would spend only a few feverish weeks ashore before setting sail again, their lives defined by the slow rhythm of departure and arrival. Reflection: the voyage as a system. The Amsterdam-Batavia route was not a heroic adventure but a carefully maintained system. Every stage, from the packing of goods in Amsterdam to the reloading in Batavia, was designed to keep the machinery of trade running with minimal disruption. It was, in its own way, a masterpiece of logistical planning, one that relied as much on patience as on skill. The sailors endured monotony so that the merchants could profit. The merchants traded goods so that the directors could satisfy shareholders. The shareholders funded the voyages that kept the ships moving. The slow boat to Batavia was thus not just a ship, but a floating link in a chain that stretched across oceans and decades. Its pace was measured, its routines predictable, but without it, the Dutch Golden Age would have been far shorter and far less golden. With the long sea lanes of the Indies behind us, our next step into boring history takes us inland, into the quiet mania of speculative markets that dealt not in ships or spices, but in flowers. Story 4: A market built on bulbs. In the winter of 1636–1637, Haarlem's taverns were full not of drinkers but of traders. Yet the tables were not covered in coins or piles of goods. Instead, they were crowded with paper contracts, scrawled in a hasty hand, committing one party to deliver at some later date a tulip bulb. Not a bouquet, not even a flower in bloom, just a bulb, dormant in the earth or stored in a merchant's shed, its petals yet to be seen, its fate bound to the seasons. These bulbs, some no larger than a hen's egg, were the center of a speculative frenzy that swept through the Dutch Republic and later became known as tulip mania. Why tulips? Tulips were not native to the Netherlands. They had been introduced from the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century and quickly became a fashionable luxury among the wealthy. Their appeal lay partly in their novelty and partly in their extraordinary variety. The most prized were the so-called broken tulips, whose petals displayed dramatic streaks and flames of contrasting color. This patterning was not the result of careful breeding, as growers believed, but of a viral infection, though no one knew it at the time. The randomness of the streaks made each bloom unique, and thus more desirable. The rarity of certain patterns, combined with the slow pace of tulip propagation, meant that some bulbs commanded extraordinary prices. The mechanics of the trade. By the mid-1630s, tulips were traded through a system of forward contracts. A buyer agreed to purchase a bulb at a fixed price for delivery in the next growing season. These agreements were often made during the winter, when the bulbs were dormant and could not be moved without risk of damage. The market was informal, operating in taverns and private houses. Contracts were recorded on slips of paper, sometimes with a simple description of the bulb, sometimes with elaborate sketches or even watercolor illustrations. Most transactions involved no physical exchange of goods until the appointed delivery date, and in many cases, the same bulb might change hands several times on paper before it was ever dug up. Haarlem as a hub. Haarlem, with its thriving community of horticulturists and proximity to major trading routes, became one of the key centers of the tulip trade. Growers in the surrounding countryside supplied bulbs to merchants in the city, who in turn sold contracts to speculators. The city's taverns doubled as trading floors. Each had its own circle of regulars, growers, merchants, and investors who met to strike deals. The atmosphere was lively, with voices raised in argument over prices, futures, and the relative merits of a given variety. A skilled trader could enter a tavern with a few contracts in his pocket and leave an hour later with twice their value promised to him. The currency of reputation. In such an informal market, trust was as important as capital. A trader's reputation for honoring contracts determined whether others would deal with him. This trust was reinforced by the fact that most participants were members of the same tight-knit community. Growers knew merchants, merchants knew speculators, everyone's fortunes were intertwined. Yet this very closeness also created a feedback loop of rising prices. If one respected trader paid an unprecedented sum for a rare bulb, others took it as proof that the market had further to climb. Soon, prices for certain varieties doubled or tripled in a matter of weeks. From collectors to speculators. At first, tulip trading was largely the province of connoisseurs, wealthy collectors who appreciated the flowers for their beauty and rarity. But as prices rose, outsiders entered the market, drawn by the promise of quick profits. Bakers, brewers, cobblers, and other tradesmen began to buy and sell tulip contracts, often with no intention of ever planting a bulb. This shift from collecting to speculation altered the market's character. The careful assessment of a bulb's quality gave way to a focus on price trends. A contract was valuable not because of the tulip it represented, but because someone else might pay more for it tomorrow. The paper chain. The result was a chain of promises extending far beyond the physical stock of bulbs. A single Semper Augustus, a variety famed for its white petals streaked with crimson, might have a dozen simultaneous contracts written against it, each promising delivery to a different buyer. Of course, only one person could ultimately receive the bulb. The rest would settle in cash, if they settled at all. This multiplication of paper claims on a single asset was not unique to tulips. Similar practices occurred in grain futures and other markets. But the tulip trade was unusual in that the underlying asset was perishable, slow to reproduce, and valued almost entirely for aesthetic reasons. A winter of rising prices. In the winter of 1636–1637, prices for rare tulips reached their peak. Contracts for a single bulb could sell for as much as the cost of a house in Harlem. Lesser varieties, once affordable to ordinary gardeners, were drawn upward in the general surge. Speculators told themselves that demand from wealthy collectors would always support these prices. After all, the Dutch Republic was at the height of its golden age. Trade was booming, wealth was flowing into the cities, and the appetite for luxuries seemed insatiable. Yet beneath the optimism, there were murmurs of caution. What would happen when the delivery season came and buyers were asked to produce the cash promised on their contracts? Could prices really rise forever, or would the market simply run out of new entrants willing to pay? The answer to that question would come swiftly, and with consequences that turned the bustling taverns of Harlem from scenes of confident speculation to chambers of quiet reckoning. The tulip trade of the winter of 1636–1637 had all the hallmarks of a market stretched to its limit. Prices rose not because of any increase in the number of bulbs or in the quality of the flowers, but because each new buyer believed there would be another buyer after them, willing to pay more. It was, in effect, a confidence game, though not in the sense of deliberate fraud. The confidence was genuine, shared by growers, merchants, and newcomers alike. So long as everyone believed in the inevitability of continued growth, the chain of transactions held. But such chains are only as strong as the weakest link, and in early February 1637, that link broke. The auction that failed. The turning point came at a routine bulb auction in Harlem. The event was intended to raise funds for the local Weavers' Guild, with the proceeds going to support guild members and their families. The bulbs on offer were high quality, and the room was full of experienced traders. Yet as the auction began, bids came in lower than expected. A lot that might have fetched 1,200 guilders the previous week barely reached 900. Another stalled at 700, prompting whispers among the crowd. When a particularly rare bulb failed to meet its reserve price, the mood shifted from curiosity to concern. Word of the week auction spread quickly through Harlem's taverns, then to nearby towns. In an age without telegraphs or newspapers, market news still moved swiftly, carried by merchants, sailors, and travelers who repeated the same unsettling phrase: buyers are hesitating. The rush to sell. In the days that followed, traders who had been content to hold their contracts began to look for buyers. Prices, once slow to change, now shifted by the day and always downward. Contracts that had been worth a small fortune were offered at steep discounts, often without finding a taker. Some traders, sensing the shift, tried to cash out entirely. They offered not just individual bulbs but entire portfolios of contracts. Others, unable to find buyers, simply stopped showing up to the taverns, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of refusing payment on deals they had agreed to only weeks before. The paper problem becomes a legal one. The collapse revealed a structural weakness in the tulip trade. Most contracts were informal agreements, backed by little more than mutual trust and the fear of social ostracism. There was no central exchange, no binding legal framework to compel payment beyond what was considered fair dealing among peers. When prices fell sharply, many buyers simply refused to honor their contracts, arguing that they had no legal obligation to do so until the bulbs were actually delivered in spring, and by then, the market price might be a fraction of what they had agreed to pay. Growers who had counted on these contracts for income suddenly faced the prospect of receiving far less than expected, or nothing at all. For those who had borrowed against anticipated tulip sales, the situation was dire. Attempts to stabilize. In February and March 1637, civic authorities and guild leaders in several Dutch cities attempted to mediate between buyers and sellers. They proposed converting the contracts into options. A buyer could walk away by paying a small penalty, typically 3.5% of the contract price. The hope was that this would allow both sides to save face. Buyers would not be forced into bankruptcy over inflated prices, and sellers would at least recover some of their losses. Yet the very introduction of such a policy was an admission that the market was not going to recover. Few people were willing to pay even the reduced penalty when they could simply vanish from the market altogether. Haarlem's sudden quiet. By April, the taverns of Haarlem that had once echoed with the noise of trading were subdued. The long tables still held mugs of beer and plates of bread and cheese, but the piles of paper contracts were gone. Some traders spoke bitterly of their losses, others refused to discuss tulips at all. For the city's growers, the new season's blooms brought little joy. Fields of rare and beautiful flowers stood as reminders of fortunes that had evaporated. A Semper Augustus that might have commanded thousands of guilders in January could now be bought for a fraction of that sum, if it could be sold at all. The ripple effects. The tulip market had never involved the majority of the Dutch population, and its collapse did not plunge the Republic into recession. But in Haarlem and other trading towns, the impact was deeply felt. Artisans and small merchants who had speculated heavily now faced debts they could not repay. Some sold property, others entered long-term repayment arrangements with creditors. The psychological effect was harder to measure but no less real. The tulip collapse became a cautionary tale almost immediately, retold in pamphlets and moralizing sermons. It was framed as a lesson in greed and folly, with lurid tales often exaggerated of sailors who accidentally ate a rare bulb, mistaking it for an onion, or of men trading entire estates for a single root. Between myth and memory. Historians have long debated the extent of the mania and its collapse. Some argue that the crisis was more limited than popular accounts suggest, affecting only a small circle of traders. Others see it as a genuine speculative bubble, fueled by the unique conditions of the Dutch Golden Age: widespread prosperity, an appetite for novelty, and the absence of centralized regulation in certain markets. What is certain is that the tulip trade of the 1630s left a mark on the cultural memory of the Netherlands. The phrase tulpenmanie still conjures images of overreach and collapse, a shorthand for the dangers of speculation detached from reality. And yet, for all the drama of its fall, the story of tulip mania is incomplete without considering what happened afterward, how growers adapted, how the flower itself continued to flourish, and how the market found a more stable, if humbler, place in Dutch life. When the tulip market collapsed in early 1637, the noise of speculation faded almost overnight, but the flower itself did not vanish from Dutch soil. The bulbs still lay in gardens and storage sheds, indifferent to the shifting fortunes of the humans who traded them. As the months passed and spring returned, tulips began to bloom in Haarlem's fields just as they had the year before, but the world around them had changed. Growers in a changed market. For professional growers, the immediate aftermath was sobering. Contracts they had counted on for income were now worthless, and bulbs that once commanded hundreds or thousands of guilders might fetch only a small fraction of their peak prices. Some growers responded by returning to a focus on horticulture rather than speculation. They cultivated tulips for sale to genuine gardeners and collectors, rather than for the paper-trading circles of the taverns. Prices settled at levels that reflected the flower's beauty and rarity without the fevered inflation of the mania. Others, burdened by debts from the speculative period, sold their stock entirely, sometimes to former competitors, sometimes to wealthy patrons willing to maintain private collections. A few left the trade altogether, turning their land to other crops with more predictable markets. The persistence of luxury. Despite the collapse, tulips remained a desirable luxury for the Dutch elite. Wealthy merchants and regents still commissioned gardens filled with orderly rows of tulips, arranged by color and variety. The broken tulips, those with streaked petals caused by the mosaic virus, were still prized for their dramatic appearance, even if their prices were now measured in tens of guilders rather than hundreds or thousands. The difference was that tulips no longer served as the focal point of speculative investment. They became once again what they had been before the mania, a sign of taste, refinement, and participation in the Republic's culture of horticultural display. Stability through regulation. In the years after the crash, local guilds and municipal authorities took steps to make future tulip trading more stable. Contracts for bulb sales were more often formalized in writing, with clearer terms for payment and delivery. The use of standardized weights and measures for bulk bulbs helped reduce disputes over quantity. Some cities required that tulip transactions take place under guild supervision, with official brokers recording the sale. This slowed the pace of trading and made it harder for speculative bubbles to inflate unnoticed. While these measures could not eliminate risk entirely, they restored a measure of confidence to the trade. The tulip as a symbol in art. If the speculative value of tulips diminished, their symbolic value in Dutch art endured. Painters of the late 17th century continued to include tulips in still-life compositions, often as part of elaborate floral arrangements alongside roses, irises, and peonies. In some cases, the tulip took on a cautionary meaning. Artists placed it alongside symbols of transient snuffed candles, decaying fruit, and skulls in vanitas paintings, subtle reminders of the fleeting nature of beauty, wealth, and life itself. In other contexts, it remained a straightforward emblem of elegance and exoticism, its origins in the Ottoman Empire lending it a faint aura of the faraway. The broader economy moves on. One reason tulip mania faded so quickly from economic significance was that the Dutch Golden Age economy was resilient. The VOC continued to dominate Asian trade, Amsterdam remained Europe's primary entrepot, and industries from shipbuilding to brewing kept workers employed. While some individuals were ruined, there was no widespread financial panic comparable to later economic crashes. Tulip speculation had been intense, but it was concentrated in specific towns and among certain segments of the population. The Republic's overall prosperity was strong enough to absorb the shock. From cautionary tale to cultural memory. Over time, the story of tulip mania took on a life of its own. Pamphlets written in the decades after the collapse portrayed it as a moral lesson against greed and folly. Some accounts exaggerated the scale of the speculation, turning it into a parable of universal participation, as if every Dutchman and woman had been caught up in the craze. By the 19th century, historians and economists were debating whether tulip mania truly deserved its reputation as the first great speculative bubble. Yet even if the numbers were smaller than legend claimed, the cultural memory was powerful enough to keep the term alive. The flower endures. In Harlem today, tulips are still grown, and the surrounding region remains one of the world's centers for bulb cultivation. The flowers that sparked so much paper speculation in the 1630s now attract tourists in spring, who come to admire the blooms without any thought of trading them as futures contracts. The varieties have changed. Some of the most famous broken tulips of the 17th century have long since disappeared, victims of the very virus that gave them their beauty, but the fascination with the flower remains. In that sense, the tulip's legacy has outlasted the market that once threatened to define it entirely. Reflection, value real and imagined. The story of tulip mania is not merely about flowers or even about speculation. It is about the human tendency to assign value to things that cannot justify it in practical terms, and to believe that such value will hold as long as others share the belief. What makes it boring history is that its resolution was not a grand disaster, but a quiet reversion to normalcy. Fields were planted, flowers bloomed, debts were settled or not, and life in the Dutch Republic went on. The most lasting impact was not economic but cultural. The cautionary tale of Haarlem's winter of paper promises, retold for centuries as a warning to those who mistake rising prices for guaranteed wealth. With the fields of Haarlem returning to their seasonal rhythm, we move from the world of gardens and contracts to the crowded decks of ships once again, this time in the company of passengers far less welcome than tulip traders. The rats that sailed with the Dutch merchant fleet. Story 5. The uninvited passengers. In the 17th century, every Dutch merchant ship leaving the harbors of Amsterdam or Rotterdam carried more than its crew, cargo, and provisions. Hidden in the shadows of the hold, darting between coils of rope and stacked barrels, another population thrived: rats. They did not appear on the ship's manifest, but their presence was as predictable as the tide. For sailors, rats were not an anomaly but a constant fact of life at sea, as much a part of the maritime environment as the creak of the rigging or the slap of waves against the hull. Why rats thrived at sea. Rats were ideally suited to shipboard life. They could squeeze through gaps no thicker than a thumb, climb rope with ease, and survive on almost anything edible or even inedible. A ship's hold provided both shelter and an abundant supply of food: grain, dried beans, salted meat, ship's biscuit, and even candle wax, which they gnawed for its animal fat content. The voyage itself offered the rats something rare on land: freedom from many predators. Cats were sometimes kept on board, but the confines of a ship gave the rodents countless places to hide. In the dark, damp recesses of the bilge, beyond the reach of both feline hunters and human crew, rats could breed unchecked. Entry points: from wharf to ocean. Rats came aboard in port, slipping up mooring lines or leaping from dockside to gangplank under cover of darkness. Some arrived hidden in cargo grain sacks, bundles of cloth, even barrels. Once on board, they could survive for months without setting foot on land. Dutch wharves in the 1600s were ideal breeding grounds for these stowaways. Grain warehouses, fish markets, and refuse heaps attracted rodent populations, and ships loading at the quayside inevitably picked up new passengers along with their official freight. The impact on provisions. For the VOC and other trading companies, rats were not just a nuisance, they were an economic threat. A determined rat colony could consume or contaminate a significant portion of a ship's provisions. Grain was especially vulnerable, as rats could chew through sacks and scatter the contents, leaving droppings and urine that made the food unsafe for consumption. Ship's biscuit, baked rock hard to last the months-long voyage, offered no real obstacle. Rats could gnaw through the wooden crates and leave behind crumbs that attracted insects. Meat, salted and stored in barrels, was less accessible but not immune. Rats would chew through the staves to reach it if other food was scarce. Even non-edible cargo could suffer. Textiles were shredded for nesting material, leather goods chewed for the salts in their tanning, and ropes gnawed into frayed weakness that could compromise a ship's rigging or mooring lines. Disease on the high seas. Beyond the loss of cargo, rats carried another danger: disease. The most feared was plague, spread by fleas that lived on the rats' bodies. While major outbreaks were rare on ships compared to crowded cities, the risk was real enough to make sailors wary. Rats could also transmit other illnesses through their droppings, contaminating water barrels and food stores. The cramped, unhygienic conditions aboard ship made disease control difficult. If sickness broke out among the crew, there was nowhere to isolate the ill, and the voyage could quickly turn from a profitable expedition into a floating quarantine. Attempts at control. The VOC and other maritime powers experimented with various methods to control rats. Cats were the most common solution, often kept as unofficial crew members. A good ship's cat could keep the rat population in check, though rarely eliminate it entirely. Some ships used rat guards, metal or wooden discs fitted around mooring lines to prevent rodents from climbing aboard while in port. These were most effective when used consistently, but not all captains considered them worth the trouble, especially on short stops. Traps, usually simple wooden or metal devices, were also employed, baited with grain or scraps of meat. Poisoned bait was less common, partly because of the risk to cats, and partly because a poisoned rat could die in an inaccessible part of the ship, creating a persistent stench. Rats as a source of food. In extreme cases, especially on long voyages when provisions ran low, sailors sometimes turned the tables and ate the rats. Accounts from the period describe rats roasted over open flames or stewed into broths. The practice carried obvious health risks, but hunger often outweighed caution. Sailors generally preferred to catch and eat the younger rats, which were considered more palatable, while older specimens were tougher and more strongly flavored. This grim culinary choice was a last resort, but it reflected the constant battle for sustenance at sea. The psychological toll. Living with rats was not just a matter of lost provisions or disease risk, it was also a strain on morale. The sound of scratching in the dark, the sudden dart of movement across a sleeping sailor's hammock, or the discovery of gnawed clothing could be infuriating. For men already enduring the discomforts of long voyages, crowded quarters, monotonous food, uncertain whether the presence of vermin added one more layer of misery. Rats were also skilled thieves. They could carry away small items like buttons, scraps of cloth, or food from a sailor's private store. On a ship where personal possessions were few, such losses were felt keenly. A problem without an end. Despite all the efforts at control, rats remained a fact of maritime life throughout the Dutch Golden Age. Even ships that managed to reduce their onboard population would often be reinfested at the next port. The problem was not confined to Dutch vessels. English, Portuguese, and Spanish ships all faced the same challenge. The persistence of rats at sea mirrored their role on land, adaptable, resilient, and impossible to eradicate entirely. As long as ships carried food and offered shelter, the uninvited passengers would remain. But rats were not the only consumers of shipboard provisions. Alongside the vermin, another form of long-term storage demanded constant vigilance. The great wheels of cheese that served as both staple and delicacy on Dutch voyages. How these cheeses survived or didn't through months at sea is a story in itself. If bread was the basic fuel of Dutch life, cheese was its enduring ballast on land and at sea. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the largest cheese exporter in Europe, and its merchant fleets carried the product to ports as far as the East Indies. Every voyage of the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, VOC, was provisioned with wheels of Edam, Gouda, or Leyden cheese, stacked in the ship's hold alongside barrels of salted herring and biscuit. Cheese had many virtues for long voyages. It was dense in calories, rich in protein and fat, and most importantly kept well without refrigeration. But life at sea tested even the sturdiest wheel of cheese, and its preservation was a matter of constant vigilance. Why cheese survived the voyage? The durability of Dutch cheese came from its preparation. The wheels were hard-pressed to remove moisture, salted heavily to discourage bacterial growth, and often coated in a layer of wax or natural rind to seal them from the air. This treatment slowed spoilage, allowing a wheel to remain edible for months, sometimes even a year if stored properly. Edam, with its distinctive spherical shape and red wax coating, was especially valued for sea voyages. It traveled well, resisted mold, and could be portioned out without crumbling excessively. Gouda, slightly softer, was more prone to drying but remained popular for its richer flavor. Leyden, flavored with cumin or caraway seeds, added variety to the otherwise repetitive shipboard diet. Storage on board. Cheese was stored in cool, dry areas of the hold, away from the bilge water and the ship's sides where condensation could seep in. Wooden shelving or slatted racks kept the wheels off the floor to allow air circulation. Aboard a VOC flight or East Indiaman, hundreds of wheels might be stacked in careful order, each marked with the dairy's stamp and the date of production. The quartermaster kept a close eye on the stores, rationing cheese alongside biscuit and meat. A typical ration might be a small wedge every few days, supplemented by fish or peas. Cheese was never the largest portion of the diet, but its rich taste made it a welcome change from the blandness of ship's biscuit. Enemies of the cheese: rats and weevils. Despite the care taken in storage, cheese was not safe from the ship's other residents. Rats would gnaw through the wax coating and tunnel into the heart of a wheel, leaving behind spoilage and waste. Sometimes a single wheel could be ruined in a night. Insect pests were a lesser threat to cheese than to grain, but weevils occasionally found their way into the stores, especially if the cheese was stored near infested biscuit barrels. Sailors accepted that some level of contamination was inevitable. What mattered was keeping the damage contained, so the stores could last until the next port. Cheese as a social commodity. On long voyages, cheese became more than a food, it was a form of currency. Sailors might trade a portion of their ration for tobacco, extra rum, or favors from shipmates. Officers, with greater access to the stores, sometimes used cheese to reward good service or loyalty. The value of cheese increased as the voyage went on. Fresh cheese, softer and more flavorful, was eaten early in the journey. By the 5th or 6th month, only the hardest, driest wheels remained, and these were sliced with care to avoid waste. At this stage, even a small piece could be worth bargaining over. Cooking with cheese. Most cheese was eaten as is, sliced into small pieces and paired with biscuit. But sailors also used it in cooking when possible. Melted into pea soup, cheese added richness and variety to a dish that otherwise relied on salted meat or fish for flavor. On calmer days, some crews baked a kind of shipboard pie, using biscuit crumbs and cheese bound together with eggs from the poultry kept on deck. These small acts of culinary improvisation helped break the monotony of the voyage. Food was more than sustenance. It was one of the few pleasures available on the long stretch between ports. Cheese in exotic ports. Cheese was also a valuable trade item in the overseas markets. In the East Indies, Dutch cheese was a novelty, prized by European expatriates and sometimes exchanged with local rulers as a diplomatic gift. Records from Batavia note cheese being sent to governors, naval officers, and favored merchants, often alongside barrels of wine or bolts of fine cloth. In tropical climates, cheese did not last as long, and the arrival of a fresh shipment from the Netherlands was an event. The wax coating helped, but heat and humidity inevitably softened the texture and altered the flavor. Sailors were often glad to unload the cheese quickly, lest it spoil before sail. When the cheese ran out. Running out of cheese was a low point in any voyage. Without it, the daily diet became relentlessly bland: biscuit, salted meat, dried peas, and perhaps fish if caught. Some captains rationed cheese more strictly than other foods, aware of its morale-boosting effect. Others were less cautious, leading to shortages long before the voyage ended. When cheese was gone, sailors sometimes resorted to makeshift substitutes, spreading rendered fat on biscuit or eating pickled vegetables when available. But these were poor replacements for the flavor and substance of Dutch dairy. The cheese and the flag. Cheese was such a staple of Dutch identity that foreign sailors sometimes referred to their rivals from the Republic as cheese-eaters. Far from taking offense, the Dutch leaned into the association. Merchants painted cheese wheels on shop signs, and cheese markets became tourist attractions in their own right. In a way, the cheese in a ship's hold carried not just calories, but a piece of the Dutch cultural flag. By the time a VOC vessel completed its round trip to the East Indies, much of the original cheese was gone, eaten by sailors, traded in port, or lost to pests. What remained was often so hard it could only be chipped away with a knife, yet it was still treasured. But while cheese could be counted, sliced, and traded, the other great constant of shipboard life, the rats, remained beyond full control. In the next section, we turn to the long, stubborn war between sailors and their verminous passengers, a struggle fought with traps, teeth, and sheer endurance. By the time a Dutch East Indiaman was 2 months into its voyage, the patterns of life, human and rodent, were well established. Sailors had their watches, chores, and meals. Rats had their scavenging runs, nesting sites, and breeding cycles. The contest between the two was ongoing and, in truth, never fully resolved. The rats were more than passengers. They were competitors for food, spoilers of stores, and a persistent reminder that control at sea was always partial. For every rat trapped or killed, another seemed to appear, slipping from the shadows as if the ship itself spawned them. The rats' daily routine. At night, when the lanterns were dimmed and the crew slept, the rats became most active. They explored the decks in quick, darting runs, pausing to sniff the seams of barrels or gnaw at the wax seals of cheese wheels. In the hold, they navigated the cargo maze with practiced ease, leaping from crate to crate or running along the edges of beams to avoid detection. Some bold individuals ventured near sleeping sailors, drawn by the smell of crumbs in coat pockets or the salted tang of leather belts. Others haunted the galley, where scraps might be left behind after cooking. During the day, rats retreated to the dark, warm spaces deep in the ship behind bulkheads, inside coils of rope, or in the bilge. These nesting areas were almost impossible to reach without dismantling parts of the vessel. Trapping and hunting. The quartermaster usually oversaw rat control, but in practice, every sailor had a stake in the effort. Simple snap traps baited with grain or pork fat were the most common tools. Some sailors preferred makeshift nooses fashioned from rope fibers, placed near known rat runs. Cats, if present, acted as both hunters and deterrents, but they could not patrol every space at once. When the ship was becalmed and duties were light, sailors sometimes organized rat hunts, arming themselves with sticks and chasing the animals from hiding places. This was as much entertainment as it was pest control, though the entertainment value came at the expense of overturning barrels and scattering cargo. The cat as shipmate. Cats were valued but not universally present on Dutch merchant ships. A good mouser could keep rat numbers manageable, but cats themselves required food, space, and care. Sailors fed them scraps from the galley and sometimes a share of dried fish. A favored cat might even sleep in the captain's cabin. Ship cats became mascots, their survival over multiple voyages seen as a sign of good fortune. Some were given names and even mentioned in ship logs. Still, even the most skilled cat could not keep up with the rate at which rats bred in the warm, food-rich environment of a ship's hold. Rats as an economic calculation. For the VOC, rats were an unavoidable cost of doing business. They reduced profits by damaging cargo, but the expense of completely eradicating them, if it were even possible, would have been higher than simply absorbing the loss. The key was to minimize the damage without slowing the voyage or delaying departure from port. Captains kept notes on which ports seemed to produce the worst infestations, and some made a point of tightening rat guards on lines or inspecting cargo more carefully in those harbors. Yet the busy pace of loading and departure often meant such precautions were hurried or skipped. The rat and the plague question. Though plague was feared, most Dutch voyages in the 17th century were not marked by shipboard outbreaks. The greater risk came when ships arrived in port and their rats mingled with local populations. Some ports had strict quarantine measures, requiring ships to anchor offshore while health officers inspected cargo and crew. The presence of rats was sometimes used as a justification for longer quarantine periods, though the effectiveness of such measures was limited without understanding the role of fleas in plague transmission. Sailors grumbled at delays, but the public health stakes were high, especially in Mediterranean ports, still scarred by earlier plague waves. Rat myths and sailor lore. Over time, rats became embedded in sailor superstition. A sudden mass movement of rats toward the upper decks was taken as a sign that the ship was in danger of sinking, a belief that had just enough anecdotal backing to persist. Some claimed that a ship with white rats was blessed with good luck, while black rats were harbingers of misfortune. Other tales were more practical. Sailors warned new recruits never to sleep with food in their hammocks, lest a rat chew through their clothing in search of a morsel. There were also whispered accounts of rats gnawing on sailors' toes or fingers, though these were likely exaggerated to frighten the inexperienced. When rats were welcome. Oddly, there were moments when rats were tolerated, even appreciated. On long voyages where food ran desperately short, sailors sometimes viewed the rodents as an emergency food reserve. Trapped and skinned, rat meat could be roasted over the galley fire or boiled into a thin stew. In such cases, the boundary between pest and provision blurred. Hunger made sailors pragmatic. A rat was meat, and meat was survival. The end of the voyage. When a ship finally returned to the Netherlands after months or years abroad, unloading the cargo also meant dislodging its rodent inhabitants. Some rats fled down the gangplanks into the city, others were trapped and killed in the emptied hold. But many remained aboard, ready to accompany the ship on its next journey. There was no final victory in the war against rats, only temporary truces between voyages. The ship and its vermin were bound together by the same trade routes, the same cargoes, and the same rhythms of departure and return. Reflection, endurance in the shadows. In the grand narrative of the Dutch Golden Age, rats occupy no celebrated place, yet their story is inseparable from that of the merchants, sailors, and ships that carried the Republic's fortunes. They were the constant, uninvited companions of empire, thriving in the same conditions that allowed human commerce to flourish. The war between sailor and rat was unwinnable, but it was fought nonetheless, night after night, voyage after voyage. In its own quiet way, this struggle reflected the endurance and adaptability that defined life at sea, where victory was measured not in final conquest but in survival until the next port. From the gnawed edges of cheese wheels and the scratch of claws in the dark, we turn next to another seemingly small detail of maritime life that shaped the Dutch trading empire: the humble ship's log, and the quiet men who wrote in it day after day, year after year. Story 6. Ink, Salt, and Patience. The life of a VOC ship's clerk. Among the crew of a 17th-century Dutch East Indiaman, some jobs drew the eye immediately. The captain, standing square at the quarterdeck, issued commands over wind and wave. The helmsman gripped the great whipstaff to hold course. The boatswain's voice carried over the deck as he marshaled sailors aloft. And then, tucked in the shadow of the captain's cabin, sat the ship's clerk, ink-stained, bent over a ledger, and largely unnoticed. Yet without the clerk, the machinery of the VOC, the largest and most powerful trading company of the age, would grind to a halt. His was the work of numbers, letters, and order, performed in cramped quarters under the constant roll of the ship. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Who was the clerk? The ship's clerk, or shraver, was usually a literate man of modest social standing. He was neither an officer in the naval sense nor a manual laborer. In the rigid hierarchy of the VOC, the clerk occupied a liminal space, respected for his literacy and precision, but not celebrated for daring feats at sea. Most clerks were recruited in the port cities of Holland, Amsterdam, Hoorn, and Kuizen, where literacy rates were high compared to the rest of Europe. Many had served as apprentices in merchant offices or as assistants in warehouses before taking a post at sea. His workspace, a floating office. The clerk's domain was a small desk, often in a corner of the captain's or supercargo's cabin. Here, in the dim light of an oil lamp, he maintained the voyage's paperwork, cargo manifests, crew rolls, pay ledgers, supply inventories, and the official ship's log. The desk was rarely still. Even in calm weather, the constant motion of the ship made writing a careful, deliberate act. Ink had to be protected from spills. Sand or blotting paper was used to dry each entry before the next. Salt air corroded metal pens and warped paper, so documents were kept in waxed leather folders or sealed chests. Duties and responsibilities. The ship's clerk served as the record keeper and accountant for the voyage. His main tasks included cargo documentation, recording every bale of cloth, chest of spices, barrel of wine, or crate of porcelain loaded and unloaded. The VOC relied on these lists for taxation, insurance claims, and settling disputes. Crew administration, keeping track of who was aboard, their position, their wages, and any disciplinary actions. When a sailor died, whether from disease, accident, or combat, the clerk noted it for payment to next of kin. Daily log entries, documenting the ship's location, weather conditions, and notable events. This was a legal document, admissible in VOC disputes and court cases. Correspondence, drafting letters to VOC officials, merchants, and sometimes even to the families of deceased sailors. It was meticulous work, requiring both accuracy and a certain emotional detachment. The clerk's relationship with the captain and supercargo. The captain commanded the ship. The supercargo oversaw the commercial interests of the voyage. The clerk reported to both. This dual loyalty could be delicate, especially if tensions arose between the captain's priorities for speed and safety and the supercargo's demands for profit. In disputes, the clerk's records became critical. A missing bale of goods, a miscounted chest of silver, or an unexplained delay could provoke inquiries upon return to the Netherlands. The clerk's job was to ensure that the paper trail was clear, defensible, and most importantly accurate. Challenges of the job. The life of a ship's clerk was not free from hardship. Space and comfort. His workspace was cramped, dark, and often damp. Ink froze in colder climates and thinned to watery inconsistency in tropical heat. Illness. Like the rest of the crew, the clerk was vulnerable to scurvy, dysentery, and fevers. If he died mid-voyage, the captain or supercargo often had to assume his duties. Monotony. While the sailors faced physical danger in storms, the clerk's trials were mental hours of repetitive entries, calculations, and corrections. And yet, there was also a certain privilege in the position. The clerk often dined better than ordinary sailors, slept in a cabin rather than a hammock, and had fewer physically grueling tasks. Paper and ink in the middle of the ocean. Writing at sea was not as simple as it might seem. Paper was expensive, imported from mills in Holland or Germany, and had to be protected from damp at all costs. Ink was made from iron gall oak galls, copperous iron sulfate, and gum arabic dissolved in water prepared before departure in large sealed bottles. Once opened, ink had a tendency to corrode pen nibs and stain everything it touched. The clerk guarded his writing supplies jealously. Losing them in mid-ocean meant improvising with charcoal or even soot mixed with seawater, which produced faint, short-lived marks. The human side of the ledger. Though the clerk's work was precise and formal, his records occasionally revealed flashes of human feeling. A marginal note might mention a sailor's good service before his death, or a brief description of unusual weather. Some clerks, in private notebooks, recorded their personal impressions: loneliness, curiosity about foreign ports, or irritation with particular officers. These private writings, when they survive, are among the richest historical sources for daily life aboard a VOC ship. They show the mind of a man who was both participant and observer, engaged in the voyage, yet apart from its most physical labors. The end of the day. When his duties allowed, the clerk might walk the deck in the evening, stretching cramped legs and taking in the sea air. He spoke with the helmsman about the day's course or ask the bosun about repairs to the rigging details he might need for the log. But when the bell rang for the next watch, he returned to his desk, lamp flickering in the pitch and roll, ready to inscribe the voyage's next line in ink that would, he hoped, outlast the salt and the years. Yet, while the ship's clerk had his place in the hierarchy, the reality was that his work was constantly at the mercy of the sea itself. In Section 2, we will follow the clerk into the moments when storms, battles, and shipwrecks threaten not only the cargo and crew, but the very records on which the VOC's fortunes depended. For all the order the ship's clerk brought to his papers, the sea was an uncooperative archivist. Saltwater warped the most carefully bound ledgers. Spray and rain blurred ink into meaningless streaks. A sudden heel in heavy weather could send an entire desk's worth of documentation sliding to the floor, scattering contracts and manifests into the bilge. It was one thing to record the events of a calm day. It was quite another to do so while the ship pitched, the lantern swung wildly above, and the ink sloshed in its bottle. Storms and the clerk's priorities. When a gale rose, the captain's orders focused on survival, reducing sail, securing cargo, and steering the safest course. For the clerk, the storm meant a different emergency, safeguarding the written record. The VOC did not excuse missing manifests because of bad weather. Papers were bundled into waxed cloth, tied with cord, and stored inside a small chest kept in the captain's quarters. In the worst weather, the chest might be moved higher up the ship to avoid flooding in the lower decks. More than one clerk, past and present, had risked injury fetching documents from a flooding cabin, wading through knee-deep water in the dark, while above, the sea hammered the hull. Fire at sea. If water was the most frequent threat to the ship's paperwork, fire was the most feared. On a wooden vessel loaded with pitch, tar, and rope, a single spark could race through the decks in minutes. The clerk's chest, though built for water resistance, could not withstand fire. A blaze in the galley or the hold might consume years of accounting and records before the pumps could make a difference. The VOC trained crews to form bucket chains instantly, and the clerk often joined in not out of duty to the ship, but from personal desperation to save the ledgers. If they were lost, the voyage's legal and financial standing could unravel. Battle and the flying inkstand. Though the VOC was primarily a trading company, its ships were armed, and the clerk sometimes found himself in the middle of battle. Naval engagements with rival powers or attacks by privateers could send iron shots smashing through the clerk's workspace. In the confusion of battle, the clerk's job shifted from writing to recording damages and casualties. Names were listed, injuries described, cargo losses noted. This was not for sentiment. The VOC needed such details for insurance claims and to press for compensation from the States General. A stray cannonball could easily scatter papers, break the ink bottle, and splatter dark stains across the manifest, making the voyage's most important record as unreadable as a sailor's drunken scrawl. Shipwreck and the rescue of the chest. The worst fate for any VOC voyage was wreck, and in those moments, the ship's clerk became an unlikely priority in the evacuation plan, not for his person, but for the chest he guarded. In a grounding on a reef or a foundering in heavy seas, the captain might order the clerk to secure the chest and prepare to abandon ship. Sailors would lash it closed, wrap it in additional layers of canvas, and if possible, lower it into the ship's boat along with silver coin chests and navigational instruments. Many such chests never reached shore, but when they did, they could make the difference between a total loss and a salvageable claim for the VOC. Port inspections and the clerk's composure. The threats did not end at sea. Upon arrival in port, whether Batavia, Malacca, or back in Amsterdam, the ship's documents were inspected by VOC officials, customs agents, and sometimes representatives of foreign powers. Errors, inconsistencies, or missing pages could delay unloading, trigger fines, or provoke lengthy disputes. The clerk was expected to present the papers in perfect order, regardless of the hardships of the voyage. It was at these moments, standing before a skeptical official with salt-stiffened pages and smudged ink, that the clerk's calm under pressure mattered most. Why the records mattered so much? For the VOC, the cargo itself was only part of the wealth a ship brought home. The paper trail, the proof of purchase, sale, taxes paid, and agreements honored was equally valuable. Without it, the company's complex network of trade, credit, and law would falter. A misplaced document could mean lost revenue, an unpaid creditor, or a shipment that could not be claimed. A destroyed manifest might void an entire voyage's worth of insurance coverage. Thus, the clerk's work was not an afterthought but a pillar of the company's empire, as essential in its way as the ship's guns or sails. The strain of responsibility. While sailors feared storms and reefs, the clerk feared the quiet disasters: a spilled bottle of ink, a page torn by accident, a tally line entered incorrectly. One wrong mark could ripple outward, causing disputes months later in Amsterdam or in a distant Asian port. Some clerks kept a second, private copy of crucial records, tucked away in their personal gear. This was unofficial and sometimes frowned upon, but it provided a measure of security against loss. The clerk's quiet triumph. When the ship reached its home port and the papers were delivered intact, the clerk felt a quiet satisfaction rarely celebrated, but deeply felt. He had preserved the voyage's memory in tangible form, ensuring that the company could turn the movement of goods across oceans into profit on the ledger. Yet even in these successes, there remained a lingering truth. The clerk's power ended with the record. What those records meant for the fortunes of merchants, the fate of sailors, and the direction of the VOC's empire was decided far above his desk. In Section 3, we will follow the story to its conclusion, tracing how a single set of records could shape legal battles, fortunes, and even the course of future voyages. When a ship of the VOC returned to the Netherlands after a voyage that might have lasted 2 or even 3 years, the work of the ship's clerk did not end with the dropping of the anchor. In many ways, it was only beginning. The chest containing the ship's documents, cargo manifests, crew rolls, voyage logs, and letters was carried ashore under guard, along with any precious metals, rare goods, or diplomatic packages entrusted to the company. The clerk often accompanied it, not as a guard but as its interpreter, the one man who could explain every figure, every notation, every marginal correction. The handover. At the company's chambers, Amsterdam, Middelburg, Hoorn, or one of the other VOC cities, the papers were presented to senior merchants and administrative officers. Here, in quiet rooms lined with ledgers older than the clerk himself, the voyage's story was retold in ink. The clerk might be questioned about why certain goods were loaded at an unscheduled port, or why a crew member's death was recorded on a particular day without a cause noted. He was expected to answer precisely, without hesitation, and always with reference to the record. Legal entanglements. Sometimes, the papers he delivered sparked legal disputes. If a merchant claimed that his goods were lost through negligence, the ship's log might be read aloud in court. If a crewman's widow contested her late husband's wages, the payroll list written in the clerk's own hand might be the deciding evidence. In these cases, the clerk's handwriting was more than a mark on a page. It was testimony. A badly formed date or ambiguous phrasing could become the hinge on which a case turned. The weight of accuracy. For the VOC, a single page could represent thousands of guilders in value. A misrecorded cargo weight could lead to overpayment or underpayment to a supplier. An incorrect count of porcelain chests might throw off an entire shipment's balance sheet. The clerk, reviewing his own work under the gaze of company officials, often felt the weight of those earlier days at sea when he had recorded the numbers in heat, in damp, or under the rolling strain of a storm, influencing voyages yet to come. The records did more than settle accounts for the past voyage. They shaped the future. If the log showed that a certain port consistently caused delays or losses, the company might reroute future voyages. If cargo tallies revealed profitable new goods, tea from China, cinnamon from Ceylon, more ships might be sent that way. Thus, the ship's clerk, though far from the company's boardroom, became an indirect architect of the VOC's strategy. His steady hand in the cramped cabin could tilt the flow of ships across oceans. A life in ledgers. Some clerks went to sea for only one voyage, then returned to land-based roles in warehouses, counting houses, or municipal offices. Others became lifelong company men, sailing again and again, each voyage adding another layer to their reputation. The most experienced clerks were valued not just for their accuracy, but for their memory of past voyages. They could recall which ports had troublesome customs officials, which shipyards delivered sound hulls, and which seasons brought the most favorable winds. The uncelebrated. Yet despite this quiet influence, the clerk rarely received fame or recognition. His name might appear in company rosters, but not in the annals of heroic voyages. His role was one of precision without applause, his greatest successes measured in the absence of disputes, the lack of missing figures. And perhaps that was the point. In the eyes of the VOC, a clerk who left no visible mark was the best kind of clerk, one whose work blended seamlessly into the smooth operation of the company's global trade. The enduring legacy of the clerk's hand. Centuries later, historians poring over VOC archives still see the neat columns, the careful signatures, the methodical accounts written aboard rolling ships. Through them, the rhythms of life at sea, the movement of goods, and the human cost of empire all come into view. What the clerk never knew was that his careful lines, made in the shadow of a lantern, would outlast the VOC itself. The company dissolved in 1799. The ink, though faded, remains. From the shadows of the captain's cabin to the vaults of the VOC chambers, the ship's clerk carried the voyage not in his muscles but in his pages. And in doing so, he shaped history in the quietest of ways, one line, one date, one total at a time. From here, we turn to Story 7, where the focus shifts from the written to the woven. The coarse, salt-stiffened fabric of sailcloth, and how its manufacture and maintenance define the lifeblood of 17th-century Dutch ships. Story 7, Canvas and Salt, the long life of a sail. If the hull of a 17th-century Dutch ship was its body, and the rigging its bones and sinews, then the sails were its lungs breathing in the wind and turning it into motion. Without them, the largest East Indiaman sat as still and useless as a warehouse adrift. But sails were not just sheets of fabric strung between masts. They were the product of years of specialized labor, expensive materials, and meticulous care. Every sail represented a chain of work that stretched from inland flax fields to the salt-crusted deck of a ship in the tropics. From field to loom, the VOC relied heavily on flax grown in the Low Countries, especially in Zeeland and Friesland, where the climate and soil suited the plant. Flax farming was a slow process. The plant took months to mature, and after harvest, the fibers needed to be separated from the woody stalks through a process called redding, soaking in water until the fibers loosened. Redding ponds were notorious for their foul smell, a tang of rot that seeped into the surrounding air. Yet without it, the strong, smooth fibers needed for sailcloth could not be extracted. Once dried, combed, and spun into yarn, the flax traveled to weaving towns like Haarlem and Leiden. Here, wide looms worked by skilled weavers produced bolts of heavy, tightly woven cloth called duck in English, from the Dutch word doek. Sizing and proofing. Raw sailcloth was not ready for the sea. Before being cut and sewn into sails, it had to be proofed against the elements. This meant treating it with a mixture of animal fat, fish oil, and sometimes tannin-rich substances like oak bark or seawater brine. The process gave the cloth a stiff, waxy feel and a pale beige or brownish tint. The proofing made the sails more resistant to rot, though nothing could make them truly immune to the combined assaults of sun, salt, and constant strain. The sailmaker's shop. On shore, sailmakers cut and sewed the treated cloth into the vast, roughly triangular or rectangular shapes that would hang from the yards. Each sail required dozens of panels, stitched together with thick, waxed hemp thread. Reinforcing patches called roping and tabling were sewn at the edges and corners to withstand the pull of the rigging. Sailmakers worked at long benches, laying out the cloth in lengths that could stretch the entire shop floor. The largest sails for East Indiamen, like the main course or forecourse, could measure over 1,000 square feet. Aboard ship, the sail locker. Once aboard, the sails were stored in the sail locker or sail room, a relatively dry, well-ventilated space low in the ship. This was the sailmaker's domain. On long voyages, a ship carried not only its working set of sails but also spares, each carefully folded and wrapped. The ship's sailmaker, or if there was none, the boatswain was responsible for inspecting the sails regularly. Even a small tear could worsen rapidly under strain, so repairs were constant. Wear and tear at sea. Salt stiffened the canvas, sunlight weakened the fibers, and the relentless pull of the wind strained every seam. The bottom edge of a square sail, known as the foot, often wore out first, frayed by rubbing against rigging or masts. In heavy weather, sails were reefed shortened by folding or tying parts of them to reduce strain. But even so, a gale could tear a sail in half, sending ragged strips flapping wildly and forcing the crew aloft to cut away the ruined canvas before it fouled the rigging. Sail repair in all weathers. Sail repair at sea was not a task for calm harbors alone. Men worked in the sailmaker's loft below deck, mending tiers with needle and palm, a leather strap with a metal disc used to push the needle through heavy cloth. But sometimes, repairs had to be made with the sail still rigged perched high on the yard, the ship rolling beneath. The sailmaker's kit included long needles, waxed thread, spare patches of canvas, and grommets small rope rings for reinforcing holes. The work demanded strength, precision, and a tolerance for being soaked by spray. Economics of canvas. Sailcloth was expensive. Outfitting a large VOC ship could require over 20 full sails, representing hundreds of guilders in material and labor. For the company, every torn sail was an investment eroded by the elements. Sails were not discarded lightly. Worn-out sails were cut down into smaller ones, repurposed for awnings, or even used as makeshift hammocks and coverings for cargo. Truly unusable pieces might be turned into coarse bags or used as scrap for repairs. The smell of the sails. Sailors often remarked on the smell of new sails, a mix of flax, tar, and fish oil proofing. As months passed, the scent changed, absorbing smoke from the galley, the tang of salt spray, and the mildew of damp storage. To VOC sailors, the smell of sails was simply the smell of the ship itself. Sails as strategy. A ship's sails were not only tools of propulsion but instruments of strategy. How a captain used them trimming for speed, reefing for control could determine whether a voyage stayed on schedule, whether a storm was survived, or whether an enemy was outrun. And so, the canvas that began as a plant in a quiet Dutch field became the living skin of the ship, its health and care as vital as any man aboard. In Section 2, we will follow these sails into moments of crisis and ingenuity, when storms shredded canvas, when repairs became acts of survival, and when a captain's decisions about sail could mean the difference between profit and ruin. If a sail was the lung of a ship, a tear in it was like a wound, one that could suffocate the vessel's progress if not swiftly treated. Out on the long routes between the Netherlands and Asia, the life of a sail was often defined not by how it was made, but by how it survived storms, sudden squalls, and the relentless work of the wind. The first signs of trouble. A sail seldom failed without warning. Small frays along the leach, the outer vertical edge, or where at the clews, the reinforced lower corners, hinted at deeper weakness. An attentive boatswain might notice the slight give in the cloth when the wind filled it, or hear a new, sharper snap in the rigging as the wind caught a strained seam. The sailmaker aboard, if there was one, often carried a small repair kit even on deck. A patch stitched in calm weather could prevent a complete tear later, but in the vast oceanic stretches of the VOC's routes, calm days were rare luxuries. Storms and shredded canvas. In storms, the great square sails were the most vulnerable. If the wind increased too quickly or the crew failed to reef in time, the canvas could balloon uncontrollably, the fibers straining until, like paper overfilled with air, it burst. When that happened, the sound was shocking, a heavy crack followed by a violent flapping, as loose edges whipped with enough force to bruise a man. The torn sail could tangle in the rigging, threatening to damage other lines or spars. Crew were sent aloft with knives to cut away the ruined cloth, often working in darkness or driving rain, their hands numb, the deck pitching below. The sailmaker's loft below deck would be filled with wet, ragged lengths of canvas needing hours, sometimes days of stitching. Improvised repairs at sea. Not all repairs could wait for harbor. Some required ingenuity with whatever materials were on hand. Sailors might overlap panels with additional rope for reinforcement, stitch patches in patterns that spread the strain away from a tier, or even sacrifice an older, smaller sail to salvage the larger. In emergencies, they used palm and needle work directly on the yards, sewing while the ship was underway. This demanded not only skill but balance, perched high above the deck, gripping the spar with knees and one hand while pushing the heavy needle through thick, salt-stiffened cloth with the other. Heat, sun, and the slow rot of canvas. Even in fair weather, sails aged quickly. Tropical sun baked the fibers until they grew brittle. Salt crystals formed between threads, grinding them down as the sail flexed. Canvas proofed against rot could still mildew in the humid calms near the equator. Sailmakers fought this by airing sails, whenever possible lowering them to dry on deck, or hanging them loose in light winds, so dampness could evaporate. The economic cost of damage. Every tier represented not only lost speed but lost money. A damaged sail slowed the voyage, delaying delivery of cargo and sometimes forcing the captain to take on repairs at expensive foreign ports. VOC records from the period include accounts of replacement sails purchased in Batavia, Surat, and even as far as Japan at prices many times higher than in the Netherlands. Such expenses could eat into a voyage's profits, which is why captains pressed their sailmakers to repair rather than replace whenever possible. Sails and survival in battle. Though the VOC's main business was trade, ships sometimes found themselves under fire. In naval combat, a well-placed shot through the rigging could cripple a vessel. Enemy gunners aimed not just for the hull but for the sails, knowing that a ship without working canvas was a sitting target. In such cases, repair became a matter of survival. Men risked their lives to haul torn sails down, patch them on deck, and rehoist them before the ship lost steerage. Some captains carried light spare sails for just this contingency, smaller and quicker to rig, allowing the ship to limp away while heavier sails were mended. The sailmaker's daily vigil. The sailmaker aboard a VOC ship lived a life of constant vigilance. Each morning, weather permitting, he inspected the sails from the deck, looking for sag, discoloration, or seams that no longer lay flat. His toolkit was as essential as the carpenter's or gunner. When the voyage was long, the sailmaker's hands developed permanent calluses from pulling waxed hemp thread through resistant cloth. His back bent over the canvas spread in the dim sail room. Moments of ingenuity. Some repairs became legend aboard certain ships. There was the time a four-course sail, split in half by a sudden gust off the Cape of Good Hope, was stitched together in less than a day by half the crew working in shifts. Or the voyage where a topsail was replaced with two smaller patched-together pieces scavenged from the sail locker, a solution so odd-looking that it earned the ship the nickname the Patchwork Galleon. Such moments, while not glorious in the eyes of history, were milestones in the memory of those aboard. Holding the wind. To a sailor, the state of the sails was the state of the voyage. Tight, clean canvas meant speed and good fortune. Ragged, patched sails spoke of hard times weathered and perhaps more to come. The men who worked those sails, hauling them up, reefing them in, repairing their wounds, knew that the difference between profit and disaster often came down to a few square yards of flax, oil, and skill. In Section 3, we will follow the journey of these sails to their end, how worn canvas was repurposed, how it left the ship's service, and how the life cycle of sailcloth reflected the cycles of the VOC's trade empire itself. The life of a sail did not end the moment it could no longer hold the wind. In the world of the 17th century Dutch East India Company, where materials were costly and long supply chains stretched across continents, nothing was wasted, not even weary, salt-stiffened canvas. From its first days on the loom to its final threads unraveling in some warehouse or dockside shed, sailcloth passed through many hands and many purposes. Its afterlife was often as long, and sometimes more varied, than its working life aboard ship. Retirement from the rigging. When a sail had been patched so many times that it resembled a mosaic of stitches more than a single piece of fabric, the ship's boatswain or sailmaker would declare it unfit for further service aloft. It might still catch wind, but the risk of catastrophic failure, splitting in a storm, tangling in the rigging, was too great. At the next port, the sail was unbent from its yard and hauled below. Often, it was carefully folded, labeled, and entered into the ship's inventory as canvas for other uses. Downsizing for secondary use. A common second life for worn sails was as smaller sails for auxiliary boats, the ship's yawl, longboat, or pinnace. The stronger portions of the old canvas could be cut away from the damaged areas, re-hemmed, and sewn into shapes more suitable for these smaller craft. Such work was practical and frugal. A topsail too weak for the mainmast could serve for years on a yawl ferrying goods between ship and shore. Awnings and covers. Sailcloth was also valuable for making awnings, temporary sunshades spread over the deck in tropical ports, or for covering cargo against rain and spray. VOC warehouses in Batavia, Malacca, and Amsterdam kept stocks of these makeshift covers, many of them sewn from retired sails. They might be patched and stained, but they kept valuable spices, tea, and textiles dry while waiting for transshipment. Hammocks and bedding. Some old sails were transformed into hammocks for sailors or rough bedding in the ship's quarters. The heavy canvas was durable, resistant to tearing, and already familiar to the men who slept in it. While it was far from comfortable, a hammock sewn from sailcloth could last for years in the damp air below deck. In emergencies, makeshift hammocks fashioned from sailcloth also served as burial shrouds, solemn, functional wrappings for a sailor's final descent into the sea. Bags, slings, and miscellaneous gear. Canvas bags for storing ropes, tools, and foodstuffs were another common product of old sails. Their strength and resistance to rot made them ideal for shipboard use. Likewise, strips of sailcloth could be twisted or braided into temporary rope slings, padding for heavy loads, or protective wraps for delicate cargo like porcelain jars or glass bottles. Shore-based recycling. Once a ship returned home, surplus old sails were often sold to chandlers or rope-walk owners. These merchants found uses for even the most ragged cloth, grinding it into pulp for paper, selling it to farmers for use as windbreaks, or cutting it into aprons and work clothes for laborers. In fishing villages along the Dutch coast, Pieces of VOC sails sometimes ended up as tenting for drying racks, where fish were hung in the open air. In poorer neighborhoods, families might use sections of canvas as makeshift roofing or wall coverings. Canvas in wartime. When the Dutch Republic was at war and in the 17th century, that was often old sails could find yet another purpose: military fortifications. Heavy canvas served as quick barricades, as covers for siege works, or even as the linings of field tents. The VOC itself, closely tied to the Dutch state, occasionally contributed surplus sailcloth to naval expeditions or coastal defenses. A record in stitches. By the time a piece of sailcloth reached its final use, it often carried a history in its fabric: patches from storms in the Indian Ocean, stains from tropical rains, burns from shipboard lanterns. To those who had worked under it, each mark might recall a moment: a near disaster off the Cape, a months-long calm in the Sunda Strait, a sudden squall in the North Sea. These memories were rarely written down, but they lingered in the silent testimony of the cloth itself. The economics of longevity. For the VOC, this thorough reuse was not merely sentimental but economic necessity. New sailcloth had to be ordered, woven, and transported, sometimes across long distances, before it could even reach the shipyards. The more uses wrung from each bolt of cloth, the less strain on the company's accounts. A single large sail might cost 50 to 100 guilders in the 17th century, equivalent to months of a common sailor's wages. Stretching its usefulness over years and multiple purposes was simply good business. The last threads. Eventually, even the most carefully repurposed sailcloth reached the end of its usefulness. Torn beyond repair, threadbare, and weakened by years of salt and sun, it might be discarded as waste. But even then, scraps could serve as kindling for the galley fire, or as cleaning rags for tar and grease. In this final stage, the cloth that once carried a ship across oceans helped maintain it in humble, unseen ways. Symbol of a ship's life. For sailors, the state of the sails was a visible measure of the ship's fortunes. Fresh canvas signaled a well-funded voyage. Patched and worn sails spoke of endurance through hardship. When an old sail finally disappeared from service, it was more than just a change in equipment, it was the closing of a chapter in the ship's life. And so, the afterlife of a sail was not merely about recycling fabric. It was about carrying forward a vessel's story, long after the wind had stopped filling its cloth.